Before he was a franchise, before the action figures, the crossovers, the cinematic universes, he was a warning, a 400-foot-tall warning that Japan tried to give the world, and the world turned into a theme park ride. Tonight we trace the long, slow, strangely beautiful journey of Godzilla, from nuclear nightmare to beloved grandfather of monsters. Get comfortable. This one goes deep. And if this is your kind of quiet, nerdy, slightly obsessive history, you belong here. Hit subscribe and let's sink into the mist. There is a particular kind of grief that a nation cannot speak aloud. It sits beneath the surface of ordinary life, in the way people avoid certain words, certain dates, certain silences at dinner tables. It lives in the space between what happened and what can be safely said about what happened. Japan in the early 1950s was a country drowning in exactly this kind of grief, and it had almost no language left with which to describe its own suffering. The war had ended, the occupation had begun, and the Americans who had dropped 2 atomic bombs on civilian cities in the span of 3 days were now Japan's administrators, their landlords, their censors, and in a deeply uncomfortable way, their protectors. You do not easily mourn a wound when the hand that caused it is also the hand feeding you. This is the world into which Godzilla was born, not in a laboratory, not in a screenwriter's pitch meeting, but in the accumulated silence of a people who had survived something they were not permitted to fully grieve. To understand what Godzilla truly was in 1954, what he meant, why he landed with such seismic force on Japanese audiences, why grown men and women wept in cinemas watching a man in a rubber suit destroy a miniature Tokyo, you have to understand the precise texture of that silence. You have to understand what Japan had lived through in the decade before Ishiro Honda pointed a camera at a monster rising from the sea. Hiroshima happened on August 6, 1945. A single bomb dropped from a single plane called the Enola Gay detonated at 8:15 in the morning with a force of 15,000 tons of TNT. In less than a second, somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people were killed outright. By the end of the year, the death toll would climb to somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000. The range itself a testament to how completely the city had been unmade, how difficult it became to count the missing when the missing had simply ceased to exist. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another bomb, another city, another 40,000 dead, and the initial blast, another 30 to 40,000 in the weeks that followed. The Japanese government, which had been preparing its population for a land invasion of the home islands, struggled to process what had just happened. This was not war, as they had understood war. This was something else, something that arrived from the sky without warning, without soldiers, without the recognizable grammar of combat, and simply erased. The survivors called hibakusha in Japanese, a word that translates roughly as explosion-affected people, carried the aftermath in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Radiation sickness, keloid scars that rose from the skin like geography, cancers that arrived years, sometimes decades later. Children born with defects, a kind of social stigma that followed the hibakusha into civilian life, where they were sometimes shunned, considered contaminated, considered unlucky, considered in ways that were never quite said aloud, but were clearly felt, as living reminders of something Japan would have preferred to move past. The bomb did not only destroy the cities it landed on, it created a category of human being defined entirely by their proximity to annihilation, and then it left those human beings to navigate a society that did not know what to do with them. And then there was the American occupation, which lasted from 1945 to 1952, and which imposed, among many other things, a strict censorship on Japanese media. You could not make films about the atomic bombings. You could not write newspaper articles that described the medical effects of radiation in detail. You could not, in any public and distributed way, process the trauma of what had happened, because the occupying power found such processing politically inconvenient. The Americans were engaged in a complex project of democratization and reconstruction, and that project had no room for Japanese grief about American bombs. The censorship was not always explicit. It did not need to be. It operated through pressure and implication, and the general understanding that certain subjects would cause certain problems, and that certain problems were not, in this new post-war arrangement, problems that Japan was in a position to invite, so the grief went underground. It became the thing beneath ordinary life. It moved through Japanese culture in displaced, indirect, heavily coded forms, because that was the only form it was permitted to take. The occupation ended in 1952, and almost immediately the floodgates began to shift. Then came March 1st, 1954. A Japanese fishing vessel called the Daigo Fukuro Maru, translated as Lucky Dragon 5, was operating in the Pacific Ocean near Bikini Atoll when the United States detonated a hydrogen bomb as part of a test series called Castle Bravo. The bomb was more powerful than the scientists had predicted, about 2.5 times more powerful, yielding 15 megatons rather than the anticipated 6. The exclusion zone the Americans had established was not large enough to account for this miscalculation, and the Lucky Dragon 5 was within the range of the fallout. White ash, radioactive coral pulverized by the blast and lifted into the atmosphere, began falling on the crew like snow. 23 Japanese fishermen were exposed to significant radiation. They became sick. Their skin burned. They lost hair. One of them, a radio operator named Aikichi Kobayama, died 7 months later. He was 39 years old. The Lucky Dragon 5 incident broke Japan open. It was not in the way of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a secret that needed to be suppressed. It happened to fishermen in international waters. It was documented. It was undeniable, and it forced Japan to confront, in broad daylight, and in the pages of every newspaper, the fact that 9 years after the end of the war, American nuclear testing was still irradiating Japanese citizens. The country erupted. There were protests. There was grief. There was a particular and overwhelming sense that Japan was caught in the middle of something vast and careless and nuclear, something that moved through the world without regard for the small human bodies in its path, and that there was nothing, no border, no treaty, no ordinary life, that could keep it out. Tomoyuki Tanaka was a producer at Tohoku Studios. He was traveling by plane over the Pacific in April of 1954, returning from a failed production meeting in Indonesia, when he looked down at the ocean and found himself thinking about the Lucky Dragon 5. He was thinking about what had come up from those waters in the form of ash and radiation and death. He was thinking about monsters. By the time the plane landed, he had the rough shape of an idea. A creature from the deep, awakened and mutated by nuclear testing, rising to destroy the world that had created it. He brought the idea to Toho. The Seist, Udio greenlit it. Ishiro Honda was brought in to direct. Honda was not an accidental choice. He had served in the Japanese Imperial Army and had been present in China during some of the war's most brutal episodes. After Japan's surrender, he had passed through the ruins of Hiroshima on his way home, walked through what had been a city and was now an absence, and the experience had marked him permanently. He did not make films as a form of entertainment, exactly. He made films as a form of reckoning. When Tanaka handed him the monster concept, Honda understood immediately what it was and what it needed to be. It did not need to be fun. It needed to be fun. It needed to be true. What Honda and his collaborators, including special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya and composer Akira Ifukube, created over the following months was something that Japanese cinema had never quite seen before, and has arguably never quite seen since. Gojira, which premiered in November 1954, was not a science fiction adventure. It was not a creature feature in the American sense, the drive-in, popcorn, date movie sense that the genre had already acquired in Hollywood. It was a horror film in the truest meaning of the word, and the horror it trafficked in was not the horror of the supernatural or the unknown. It was the horror of the entirely devastatingly real. The creature that rises from Tokyo Bay in Honda's film moves with a terrible, indifferent weight. It does not attack with malice. It does not hunt. It simply moves, and where it moves, things cease to exist. Buildings collapse. Fires bloom. People run in the particular way that people run when they do not know where to run, because there is no direction that is safe. The film's special effects sequences. Tsuburaya's miniature Tokyo being methodically demolished beneath Haruo Nakajima's rubber-suited feet, are shot not with the kinetic excitement of an caution sequence, but with a grief-soaked slowness that feels almost documentary. This is not spectacle, this is aftermath. This is what it looks like after. Akira Ifukub's score is essential to this effect. The famous Godzilla theme, that slow four-note descent, like footsteps of something enormous and inevitable, does not excite, it mourns. It is the sound of something terrible that cannot be stopped, scored not with the brass-heavy triumph of a monster being defeated, but with the low, sustained dread of a world that has lost its ability to protect itself. Listen to that theme, and try to feel joy. You cannot. It is physically structured to produce something closer to the feeling of watching a city burn on the news. The helpless, distant, we cannot look away quality of witnessing catastrophic destruction from outside the frame. The human characters in Gojira are not heroes in any straightforward sense. They are people caught between impossible choices. Dr. Serizawa has developed a weapon, the oxygen destroyer, that can kill Godzilla, but he refuses to use it because he fears what will happen when the weapon's design becomes known to the militaries of the world. He is a scientist who has made something terrible in his laboratory, and he is haunted by the prospect of what comes next. This is not a difficult subtext to read. This is a Japanese film made in 1954 featuring a scientist who has made a weapon of mass destruction and is terrified of its proliferation. The script is not being subtle. It is being as direct as the censors and the cultural moment will allow. The film ends not with celebration but with sorrow. Godzilla is destroyed. Or is he? But the final note is not relief. The scientist who kills him dies in the process, taking the secret of the oxygen destroyer with him, and the last words of the film suggest that so long as nuclear testing continues, here will be more Godzillas. The monster is not the exception. The monster is the consequence. And consequences, unlike monsters, do not stay dead. Japanese audiences understood this. They did not need it explained to them. They went to see Gojira in enormous numbers. Nearly 10 million people in its initial release, which was extraordinary for the time. And many of them wept, not because the special effects were frightening, though they were, not because the human drama was moving, though it was, but because the film had done something that almost nothing else in Japanese public life had managed to do in the 9 years since the end of the war. It had named the thing. It had given shape and scale and physical form to the grief that had been living underground, given it a name that was not Hiroshima and not Nagasaki, and not Lucky Dragon 5, that somehow contained all of them. It had made the unspeakable speakable by making it enormous, by making it fictional, by making it a monster. Because in 1954 Japan, a monster was the only container large enough to hold what actually happened. This is what Godzilla was. Not a metaphor in the academic sense. Not a clever authorial device that the audience appreciated intellectually while feeling nothing. A metaphor in the oldest, most necessary human sense. A shape given to something that would otherwise be shapeless. Grief that cannot be processed directly can sometimes be processed sideways, through fiction, through displacement, through the safe but real terror of watching something that is not the thing, but is structured exactly like the thing, that produces in the body the same response as the thing, that lets you feel what you need to feel. In a context where feeling it is survivable, the bomb had no face. It had arrived from the sky, and there was no one to look at, no one to confront, no eyes to meet. Godzilla had a face. He could be faced. You could watch him come and watch him destroy, and watch him be destroyed. And the watching was not nothing. The watching was, in the fullest sense of the word, catharsis. The thing Aristotle described when he talked about what great tragedy does to an audience. Not entertainment. Release, the pressure of an unexpressed emotion finding. Finally, a channel. He was the bomb given scales and a scream. And Japan screamed back. That is what was lost when the film was Americanized 2 years later. That is what was lost in almost every subsequent iteration of the character. For the next several decades, the Americans looked at Gojira and saw a monster movie. They saw something they already had a category for. The creature feature, the beat picture, the thing that attacks the city, and they folded Honda's film into that category and cut out what didn't fit. What they cut out was the grief. What they cut out was the history. What they kept was the spectacle. Because spectacle translates easily and grief does not. Because grief requires that you know it is being grieved. And in 1956 America, almost no one in a movie theater knew what was being grieved. But in Japan, they knew. They always knew. And that knowing is why, 70 years later, Godzilla is not simply a franchise, or a brand, or an intellectual property valued in the billions of dollars. He is all of those things now. He has been turned into all of those things with remarkable efficiency. But underneath all of it, in the original text, in the film that Honda made in 1954, with all the seriousness and sorrow he could bring to bear, there is still the wound. There is still the creature born from irradiated water, an unprocessed national trauma, still moving through a burning city, still making that sound, that low, mournful four-note sound, that is not the sound of something fray, whitening. It is the sound of something that has already happened. It is the sound of a country remembering what it cannot stop remembering, dressed in rubber and scales and made enormous, because the actual size of the thing it represents has always been too large to show directly. The wound walks. It has always walked, and it will keep walking as long as the world keeps doing the things that make such wounds necessary. There is a moment in the original 1954 Gojira that film scholars return to repeatedly. A moment that has been analyzed and written about and cited in documentaries and retrospectives for 7 decades, and yet it remains stubbornly, almost mysteriously affecting no matter how many times you watch it, or how much context you carry into the viewing. Godzilla has emerged from Tokyo Bay. He is moving through the city, and there is a shot, low angle, looking up, where he pauses, just for a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible hesitation before the next step. Film critics have described this pause as menacing, as deliberate, as the terrible patience of a creature that knows it cannot be stopped, and therefore feels no urgency. They have written about the philosophy of that pause, the existential weight of it, the way it communicates something about indifferent power that faster, more aggressive movement never could. What they are describing without knowing it is a man trying to catch his breath. His name was Haruo Nakajima. He was born in 1929 in Yamagata Prefecture, in the mountainous interior of Honshu, the son of a family that had no particular connection to film or theater or performance of any kind. He came to acting through the post-war chaos that scrambled so many Japanese lives and careers, finding his way to Toho Studios as a young man in the late 1940s, where he worked initially as a stuntman and action performer. He had a physical intelligence that the studio recognized early, a quality of bodily awareness, of knowing precisely where his weight was and where it was going, that made him valuable in ways that went beyond ordinary stunt work. He could fall convincingly. He could fight convincingly. He could move through space with a quality of presence that the camera found interesting. None of this prepared him for what Eiji Tsuburaya asked him to do in 1954. The suit that Tsuburaya's team built for Gojira was unlike anything that had been constructed for a film before, because there was no tradition to draw from, no prior art, no manual for how to build a functional monster costume that could be worn by a human performer and photographed against miniature sets in ways that would read as convincingly enormous on screen. Tsuburaya's team was working from intuition, from craft, from the particular problem-solving ingenuity that comes from having no choice but to figure something out from scratch. The suit was made primarily from a material called corium, a thick, dense, latex-like compound, reinforced with internal structure, and it was built in sections that were assembled around the performer's body. The head was a separate piece. The tail was attached but semi-independent, operated partly by Nakajima's movement and partly by the physics of its own weight dragging behind him. The finished suit weighed approximately 200 pounds. Some accounts put it slightly lower, some slightly higher, but the general consensus across the testimony of everyone involved is that it was somewhere in the vicinity of 200 pounds of dead weight distributed across the body of a man who was himself about 150 pounds. Nakajima was not a small person by the standards of post-war Japan, but he was not a large one either. He was a professional athlete in the sense that stuntmen are professional athletes. Lean, strong, trained, accustomed to physical discomfort in the service of a shot. None of that training was specific preparation for carrying 200 pounds of rubber and latex in a temperature-controlled studio where the temperature was, in practice, not controlled at all. The heat was the central fact of the experience. Everything about working inside the Godzilla suit returned, eventually, to the heat. The suit was not ventilated. There was no circulation of air within the costume. The material that made it visually convincing, that dense, thick compound that caught light in ways that read as scaled and textured and real on film, was exactly the material least suited to the dissipation of body heat. It absorbed and retained warmth with tremendous efficiency. Once Nakajima was inside the suit and the various sections had been assembled around him and sealed, he was enclosed in what amounted to a full-body thermal chamber that began accumulating heat from the moment he started moving, and did not stop. Physical exertion generates heat. The human body manages this heat through sweating, through increased circulation, through the radiation of warmth from skin surface to surrounding air. None of these mechanisms function properly inside a sealed rubber suit. The sweat had nowhere to go. The skin surface was insulated from the surrounding air. The body's cooling systems were operational, but their outputs were trapped, cycling back into the enclosed space, raising the internal temperature of the suit in a continuous upward progression that had no ceiling except the one imposed by the performer's physical limits. Nakajima has described the experience in interviews conducted throughout his later life with a matter-of-fact precision that is more affecting than any more dramatic account would be. He did not, by temperament, reach for exaggeration. He was a craftsman who took craft seriously, and his descriptions of working in the suit are the descriptions of a craftsman assessing conditions and adapting to them. The heat, he said, was something you adjusted to, in the sense that you had no alternative. You learned what your body could and could not do. Within those conditions, you learned how long you could sustain movement before the heat became a technical problem, before your legs stopped responding with the precision the shot required, before your vision narrowed, before the specific quality of cognitive clarity that physical performance demands began to soften and blur. The weight loss of 20 pounds per shoot is not a dramatic flourish. It is a measurement of fluid loss through sweating within the sealed environment of the suit. 20 pounds of water weight is approximately 2.5 gallons of fluid leaving the body in the course of a single day's shooting. Sports medicine would classify this level of dehydration as severe, the kind of fluid loss that in clinical contexts produces symptoms including muscle cramping, decreased coordination, impaired judgment, and in extreme cases, organ stress. Nakajima was experiencing this not once but repeatedly, across multiple films, across multiple decades. He wore the Godzilla suit for 12 films spanning from 1954 to 1972. 18 years of shoots. 18 years of climbing into that heat. Between takes, assistants would help him out of the suit. A process that itself took time and effort, given the complexity of assembly, and he would drink water and rest and allow his body temperature to begin its descent towards something manageable. And then he would climb back in, and the process would begin again. There are accounts from crew members of the fluid pooling at the bottom of the suit when it was removed at the end of the day, the physical residue of what the performer, Nyes, had cost Subriya, who was by all accounts a demanding director, with exacting standards for his special effects sequences, is also described as genuinely concerned for Nakajima's well-being, aware that what he was asking had real physical consequences, and trying within the constraints of the production to manage the shooting schedule in ways that gave the performer adequate recovery time. Whether he always succeeded is another matter. Films are made under commercial pressures that do not always accommodate the physiological needs of the people making them. What Nakajima had to accomplish inside those conditions was not simply endurance alone. The capacity to survive the heat and the weight and the fluid loss was necessary, but not sufficient. What he had to accomplish was performance. Specifically, he had to move a 200-pound suit in ways that would read on camera as the movement of a living creature of impossible size, against miniature sets that had been constructed to a specific scale, in a way that was consistent from take to take and shot to shot, and would cut together into a coherent sequence. This is a technical problem of remarkable complexity. The fundamental challenge of suitmation, the technique Tabaraya developed and that Nakajima embodied, is the problem of scale. When you film a man in a suit walking through miniature buildings, the physics of his movement do not automatically read as the movement of a giant. A human being walking at normal pace produces a stride rhythm that the eye and brain recognize as human scale. The swing of the arms, the speed of the leg movement, the impact of the foot striking the ground, all of these carry encoded information about size, and if that information is inconsistent with the visual scale of the environment around the performer, the illusion collapses. Tsuburaya's solution was to slow erytherizing down. Nakajima was instructed to move at roughly a quarter of his natural walking pace, with deliberate exaggeration of each element of the stride, the lift of the leg, the extension of the foot, the weight transfer from heel to toe, the recovery in the next step. The tail required constant attention because its natural drag, when he moved at reduced speed, could create visual rhythms inconsistent with the rest of the motion. The arms had to carry their weight differently than they would in normal human movement, slightly extended, slightly apart, in postures that communicated mass and suggested that the creature they belonged to was built on a scale that made ordinary arm positioning physically impractical. All of this had to be maintained inside a sealed rubber chamber at temperatures that no responsible athletic trainer would permit a professional athlete to perform in. The physical intelligence required the precise, sustained bodily awareness necessary to execute consistent scale-appropriate movement, while the body's core temperature climbed and the muscles fatigued, and the available cognitive bandwidth for anything other than survival steadily narrowed. Was not the intelligence of a stuntman. It was something closer to the intelligence of a very unusual kind of dancer, someone who had internalized a movement vocabulary so completely that it could be produced even as the conscious mind was increasingly occupied with the basic business of staying functional. Nakajima studied animals. This is documented. He visited the zoo. He watched how elephants moved, how bears moved, how creatures of genuine mass negotiated the physical world. He was looking for the logic of heaviness, for the specific ways in which real weight shapes the movement of the body that carries it. He found what he was looking for in the elephant, particularly in the way an elephant stride carries a sense of inevitability, of inertia so substantial that each step is not so much a decision as a controlled continuation of something that has already begun. He brought this quality into the suit. He brought the elephant's relationship to gravity into Godzilla's walk. And Tsuburaya filmed it at reduced speed, and the camera and the miniature sets and the reduced pace, and the animal movement vocabulary combined into something that read on screen as genuinely enormous. The pause, the hesitation that film scholars have written about for 7 decades, the moment of terrible patience before the next step. What Nakajima was doing in those moments was what any performer inside those conditions would eventually do. He was letting his body rest for as long as the shot would allow. He was taking the half second his cardiovascular system was demanding before committing to the next movement. He was, in the most literal physical sense, surviving, and Tsuburaya, watching the footage, recognized that these moments of survival, these involuntary pauses imposed by physiology, read on camera as something that no amount of deliberate choreography might have produced. They read as the pause of a creature for whom hurry is a concept too small to apply. They read as the comportment of something so large and so old and so powerful that the very notion of urgency was beneath it. The accident became the art. The limitation became the aesthetic. The man barely surviving inside rubber became on screen. the thing that could not be stopped. This is more common in filmmaking than the mythology of cinema typically acknowledges. The mythology prefers the story of the visionary director who sees in his mind exactly the image he wants and constructs the world around him until the world matches the image. And sometimes that is the true story. But often the true story is closer to what happened on the set of Gojira, a set of physical and material constraints that forced improvisation, and improvisation that found in the gap between what was intended and what was possible something better than either. Tsuburaya wanted a convincing monster. What he got was a convinced one. A creature whose physical reality on screen derived not from sophisticated technology or seamless illusion, but from the genuine physical effort of a real human body pushing against genuine physical limits. The miniature sets that Nakajima moved through were themselves a feat of construction. Tsuburaya's team built Tokyo in extraordinary detail at a scale that would read correctly against the suit. Streets, buildings, elevated train lines, port structures, all rendered with enough specificity to create the visual grammar of a real city even at a fraction of its actual size. Some materials were chosen for their visual properties under the specific lighting conditions of the stage. Others were chosen for their practical behavior when the suit made contact with them. A building needed to collapse in a way that looked at the shooting speed and with the degree of camera manipulation that the finished sequence would involve, like the collapse of an actual steel frame structure. Tsuburaya's team experimented extensively with materials and construction methods to get this right. When Nakajima's foot came down on a miniature building, both he and Tsuburaya needed the result to look like the truth. The collaboration between the performer and the director of special effects was continuous and intimate. Nakajima could not see the miniature set with any real precision from inside the suit. The eye holes were limited, the visual field was narrow. The distance from his actual eyes to the exterior of the suit's head meant that his perception of his immediate environment was partial, and often unreliable. He relied on marks, physical indicators placed on the stage floor, that told him where to step, where to turn, where to stop, and on the communication of Tsuburaya's team between takes, adjusting his position and trajectory based on how the previous footage had looked. He was performing, in a real sense, blind, moving through a world he could not fully see, at a pace imposed by the requirements of the camera, rather than his own body, in conditions that were steadily depleting his ability to execute what was being asked of him. He did this for 18 years. The later suits were different. As the Godzilla franchise evolved and expanded through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the suits changed in design, in material, in weight. Some were lighter. Some introduced modifications intended to improve visibility or reduce the worst of the heat accumulation. Nakajima adapted to each iteration, learning its specific properties and limitations, developing the movement vocabulary appropriate to each new version of the character. The Godzilla of the mid-1960s is a different creature, physically, from the Godzilla of 1954, less terrifying, more expressive, capable of a kind of lumbering comedy that the franchise was deliberately cultivating. As it repositioned Godzilla from national nightmare to children's hero, Nakajima performed this transformation with the same professionalism he had brought to everything else. If he had opinions about the direction the character was taking, he mostly kept them to himself. He was a craftsman. The craft was what mattered. He retired from the suit in 1972, after the 12th film, his body having made the argument that 18 years was enough. He was 43 years old. He went on to other work, other performances, other phases of a career that extended well into his later decades. He gave interviews, he attended conventi. He met the fans who had grown up, watching his performances without knowing they were watching him, without knowing there was a him inside the creature they loved. He seemed genuinely pleased by the attention, genuinely moved by what it meant to people that there had been a man inside that suit. A specific man with a specific body and a specific set of physical strategies, and a specific willingness to suffer in service of an illusion. He died in August 2017 at the age of 88. The obituaries noted that he had played Godzilla. They noted the suit, the weight, the heat. Some of them included the detail about the 20 pounds of water weight because it is the kind of detail that communicates something efficiently, something about what the performance actually cost. What they could not fully communicate was what it means that the most iconic monster in cinema history, the creature that has grossed billions of dollars across 70 years of franchise, the creature that is recognized on every continent, the creature that has been analyzed by scholars as a profound metaphor for nuclear anxiety and postmodern alienation and the hubris of industrial civilization, moved the way it moved because a man inside a rubber suit was conserving energy, was catching his breath, was, in the most ordinary and human and unglamorous way imaginable, trying to make it to the end of the take. There is something in this that feels important to hold on to. Not as a deflation of the myth. The myth is real. The films are real. The effect they produced in audiences was real and remains real, but as a reminder that the things which move us most are often made by people operating at the edge of what they can physically sustain, in conditions that are not romantic, by means that are not magical, by a man in a suit that weighed more than he did, in a room that was trying to cook him a val, live, taking a half-second pause that the whole world would one day interpret as the patience of a god. He was not a god, he was Haruo Nakajima. And that is, in the end, the more extraordinary story. There is a version of this story that is easy to tell and easy to understand, a version in which the Americans were simply careless, or simply commercial, or simply incapable of recognizing what they had been handed when a Japanese monster film crossed the Pacific and landed on the desk of a Hollywood distribution company in 1955. In this easy version, the Americanization of Gojira was an act of ignorance, well-meaning perhaps, or profit-motivated certainly, but essentially innocent in the way that ignorance is innocent. They did not know what they were cutting. They did not know what the film meant. They looked at it and saw a monster movie, because monster movies were a thing they already had a category for, and they made it into the thing they already knew how to make. This version is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely right either. And the parts it gets wrong are the parts that matter most. The full story requires sitting with a more uncomfortable possibility that some of the people involved in transforming Gojira into Godzilla, king of the monsters, had at least a partial understanding of what the original film was doing, and that this understanding made the cutting more deliberate, not less. That the removal of the anti-nuclear subtext was not purely the result of failing to notice it. Was there, but in some cases the result of noticing it was there and deciding, for reasons that were entirely coherent within the political and commercial logic of 1955 America, that it needed to go. To understand why, you have to understand what America was in 1955, and specifically what America's relationship to its own nuclear program was in 1955, and more specifically, what the American entertainment industry's relationship to that program was. The United States had dropped atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities 10 years earlier. In the decades since, it had conducted dozens of additional nuclear tests, developed hydrogen bombs orders of magnitude more powerful than the weapons used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and entered into a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union that was shaping every dimension of American foreign policy and a significant portion of American domestic culture. The official position of the United States government on its nuclear program was that it was a necessary and responsible component of national defense, a deterrent that kept the peace by making the consequences of aggression too catastrophic for any rational actor to contemplate. This position was not simply government propaganda in the dismissive sense. There were serious people who believed it sincerely and argued for it with genuine intellectual conviction. But it was also a position that required the suppression of certain kinds of public discourse, because certain kinds of public discourse were incompatible with it. Specifically, it was a position incompatible with sustained public attention to what nuclear weapons actually did to human bodies and human cities. The official story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in American public culture in the 1950s was not the story of 200,000 dead civilians and decades of radiation sickness and a category of human being defined by their proximity to annihilation. The official story was the story of a war ended, of American lives saved, of a necessary evil that had prevented a greater one. This story required the other story, the story of the Hibakusha, the story of the Hibakusha, the story of Eikichi Kuboyama dying of radiation poisoning on a fishing boat, the story that Honda had encoded into every frame of Gojira, to remain as quiet as possible. Into this context arrived a film that was, in its original form, an extended, emotionally devastating argument that nuclear weapons were monstrous, that the countries deploying them were creating something that could not be controlled and would not distinguish between combatants and civilians, and that the appropriate response to this situation was not deterrence theory or cold strategic calculation, but grief. Raw, unmediated, Japanese grief. The kind of grief that looked at the sky and remembered what had come from it. Terry Morse was the American director hired to make Gojira releasable for the U.S. market. Edmund Goldman was the producer who had acquired the American distribution rights for a reported $25,000, a figure that itself communicates something about how seriously the original film was being taken as a commercial proposition. The plan was straightforward. Take the existing Japanese footage, add new material featuring an American actor to provide a point of identification for American audiences, cut the film to a length and pace more consistent with American genre expectations, and release it in the drive-in market alongside the other features that were doing reasonable business at the time. The goal was not to create something new. The goal was to make something foreign acceptable. Raymond Burr was not yet Perry Mason. He was a working character actor with a solid reputation for playing heavies, villains, antagonists, morally compromised authority figures in a wide range of Hollywood productions. He was chosen for the role of Steve Martin, an American reporter in Tokyo who conveniently witnesses the Godzilla attacks and conveniently serves as narrator for the entire film. Because he was available, because he was professional, because he could deliver the required material efficiently and without fuss and back. His physical size and solid on-screen presence gave him a quality of authority that the narration required. He was, by all accounts, perfectly pleasant about the whole project. He shot his footage in roughly a week. He never appeared on screen with any of the original Japanese cast. Because he was never on the same set as any of the original Japanese cast, his scenes were filmed on separate sets, with a Japanese-American actor named Frank Iwanaga, who bore some physical resemblance to the original film's lead actor, used as a stand-in for reverse shots and reaction inserts. The technical ingenuity required to make this work, to cut Burr's newly filmed material into the existing footage in ways that appeared seamless, or at least adequately convincing, was real and should not be entirely dismissed. Morse was a competent editor and director working with limited resources and a tight schedule, and some of what he achieved in the intercutting of old and new material was genuinely skilled. There are moments in King of the Monsters where the splice is nearly invisible, where Burr appears to be occupying the same space as the original characters in ways that required careful attention to eyeline, lighting, and the precise selection of insert shots. The craft of the deception was not nothing, but the deception itself, the thing the craft was in service of, was the wholesale replacement of the film's emotional and political architecture with something fundamentally different. And this is where the easy version of the story, the version about innocent ignorance, begins to strain. The scenes that were cut from the American version were not randomly selected. They were not removed because of pacing concerns or runtime requirements alone, though those justifications were certainly offered. The scenes that went were the scenes that did the specific political and emotional work that the original film had been constructed to do. They were the scenes in which Japanese characters spoke directly about what nuclear weapons meant to Japan. They were the scenes in which the connection between Godzilla and the atomic bombings was made most explicit, in which the metaphor, if you want to call it a metaphor rather than a direct statement, was articulated with the least ambiguity. They were the scenes of civilian suffering that Honda had filmed with the gravity and sorrow of documentary, The scenes that were not exciting, not spectacular, not useful for a drive-in audience looking for thrills, but that were the moral and emotional core of the film he had made. One scene in particular stands as the emblem of what was lost. In Honda's original cut, there is a sequence in a hospital following a Godzilla attack in which a mother holds her children and tells them they will soon be together with their father, who is understood to be dead. The scene is quiet. It is slow. It has no special effects, no monster, no action. It exists purely to insist on the human cost of what the audience has just watched, to refuse to let the spectacle of destruction be entertaining without consequence, to pull the camera down from the scale of the monster to the scale of the people the monster is destroying. It is the scene that most clearly announces what kind of film Honda believed he was making. It is the scene that most completely resists the genre category of creature feature. It is the scene that most directly evokes, without naming them, the hospitals of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the mothers in those hospitals, the children in those hospitals. It was cut entirely from the American version. What replaced it, or rather what filled the space its absence created, was Raymond Burr's narration, a continuous, calm, journalistic voiceover that framed everything the audience was seeing as spectacle to be observed and reported rather than suffering to be witnessed and felt. The voiceover is not malicious. It is not contemptuous of the Japanese people or dismissive of their losses in any explicit way, but it performs a function that is precisely opposed to what Honda's original construction performed, where Honda had forced the audience into identification with the suffering, had made them sit in the hospital, had made them look at the mother and the children. Burr's narration positioned the audience outside the frame, as observers positioned the audience outside the frame, as consumers of an extraordinary event being described by a professional observer. The grief was not denied. It was simply relocated to a distance from which it could not touch you. This is the transformation that matters. Not the cutting of specific scenes, though that matters too. Not the addition of an American protagonist to provide a surrogate for audiences who might find Japanese characters less immediately relatable. Though that is its own telling choice, the transformation that matters is the fundamental repositioning of the audience's relationship to what they are watching. Gojira had been constructed to make you feel implicated, to make the monster's destruction feel like something that was happening to people you were required to care about, because Honda had spent the film's first act making you care about them, building the human relationships with the patience of a filmmaker who understood that the destruction would only mean something if the things being destroyed meant something first. King of the Monsters converted this implication into observation. It gave you a reporter to stand behind. It gave you a professional witness, whose job was to describe the event rather than to be devastated by it. The reporter files copy. The American version was a commercial success. It performed well in the drive-in market it had been designed for, and it introduced Godzilla to American audiences, who would sustain their relationship with the character through the subsequent decades of sequels and remakes and reboots. This is not nothing. The American version is, in a real sense, responsible for the global reach of the Godzilla franchise, for the fact that a creature born from Japanese trauma became recognizable on every continent. Without King of the Monsters, without the commercial viability it demonstrated, it is genuinely unclear whether the Toho franchise would have developed the international profile that has sustained it for 70 years. But the price of that reach was the evacuation of the content that had made the original worth reaching for, and the haunting that this evacuation produced. The way it shaped everything that came after, in the West specifically, is the thing that has never been fully resolved. The pattern that Morse and Goldman established in 1956 became the template for how Western culture would engage with Godzilla for the next several decades. The monster was interesting. The spectacle was marketable. The metaphor was inconvenient. Keep the first two, remove the third. This formula was applied, not just to the Americanization of the original film, but to the general Western cultural understanding of what Godzilla was and was for. He was a creature feature. He was a big lizard that knocked over buildings. He was, at his most sophisticated, a symbol of the dangers of science, but science in the generic cautionary tale sense, not nuclear weapons specifically. Not American nuclear weapons specifically, not the specifically lived historical experience of a specific country that had had those weapons used on its civilians, and had then been occupied by the country that used them, and had been prohibited from publicly processing that experience for years. When American studios eventually made their own Godzilla films, the 1998 Roland Emmerich version, the legendary Monsterverse beginning in 2014, they worked almost entirely within the framework that King of the Monsters had established. The monster was the point. The action was the point. The action was the point. The human characters existed to react to the monster and to survive or not survive, and their survival or non-survival was a matter of audience engagement rather than moral weight. The 1998 film is the most egregious example, having removed not just the nuclear subtext but any subtext at all, replacing Honda's careful construction with pure blockbuster mechanics, and producing something so emptied of meaning that Toho's response, renaming the creature Zilla, stripping the god from its name, having the real Godzilla destroy it in seconds, reads less as corporate territorial behavior than as a precise artistic judgment. That is not Godzilla. That is what is left when you remove everything Godzilla means, and keep only the shape. The 2014 Gareth Edwards film made a genuine and partially successful attempt to restore some weight to the American version, to slow the monster down, to build human stakes, to use destruction as something more than pure spectacle. Edwards has spoken in interviews about his engagement with Honda's original vision, his desire to make a film about Godzilla that felt like it was about something. The film is imperfect, and its sequels progressively abandon the restraint he had tried to establish, but the impulse was real and the result contained moments. A particular shot of Godzilla's back fin moving through the Golden Gate Bridge's fog, the terrible patience of that movement, that carried genuine echoes of what Honda had achieved, but echoes are not the thing itself. And the reason they are not the thing itself is that thing itself required a specific historical context that no American film can replicate, because American films cannot occupy the position that Honda's film occupied. Gojira was made by the people who had been bombed. It was made from inside the wound. Its power derived from the specificity of that position, from the fact that when Honda put a mother in a hospital with her children, and let the camera sit with her in silence, he was not making a general humanist statement about the tragedy of war. He was making a specific statement about a specific thing that had happened to his country at the hands of a specific other country that was now occupying his country and had recently irradiated his country's fishermen with a hydrogen bomb test. American cinema cannot make that film. Not because American filmmakers lack talent or sincerity, but because the position is not available to them. You cannot make the film from inside the wound, if you are the wound. What American cinema can do, what it has occasionally tried to do, is acknowledge the wound's existence. Acknowledge that there is something in the original film that is not available in the American version, that was cut in 1956, and has not been fully restored since. This acknowledgement is not nothing. It is not the same as the film Honda made, but it is better than the continued pretense that Godzilla, King of the Monsters, was an adequate translation rather than a careful subtraction. The subtraction haunts because it established a precedent, not just for Godzilla but for the general practice of American engagement with foreign cinema, foreign culture, foreign grief. The pattern is recognizable beyond this single case. Take what travels, leave what doesn't. Take the spectacle, the action, the creature, the commercially legible surface. Leave the history, the politics, the specific texture of suffering that requires context to understand and that resists reduction to genre conventions. Make it comfortable. Make it fast. Give the audience someone to stand behind who speaks their language and reports the event from a professional distance, so they never have to be inside it. The grief became spectacle. And the spectacle was, by the standards of its market, a success. That success is the most haunting thing of all. Not that the cutting was done, but that the cutting worked. that American audiences embraced King of the Monsters enthusiastically, went to see it in drive-ins, fell in love with the monster, sustained a franchise across decades, and did so in almost complete ignorance of what had been removed. The film they loved was a subtraction. The creature they adopted as a piece of popular culture was a creature whose meaning had been taken out before they met him. They knew the shape but not the wound it had been made from. And somewhere in that gap, between the shape that everyone knows and the wound that most people don't, Ishiro Honda's film is still waiting, still running in its original form, though people don't. Ishiro Honda's film is still waiting, still running in its original form, still featuring the mother in the hospital, still refusing to let the spectacle be only spectacle, still insisting that the monster means something specific, and that the specific thing it means is the most important thing about it, still asking, in Japanese, in 1954, with all the directness that a people who had been told to be quiet could manage, "Do you understand what you have done?" There is a particular kind of institutional decision that looks from the outside like a betrayal, and looks from the inside like survival, and turns out from the distance of several decades to be both of those things simultaneously and also something else entirely, something that neither the people who made it nor the people who criticized it fully understood at the time. The decision Toho Studios made in the early 1960s to gradually transform Godzilla from an instrument of nuclear terror into a protector of humanity, and eventually into a creature gentle enough to play with a small rubbery child, was exactly this kind of decision. It was commercially motivated. It was aesthetically costly. It produced films that the people who loved the original would struggle to defend. And it created something that the original, for all its power and seriousness and grief, could never have created on its own. A relationship between a monster and an audience that has lasted across generations, across cultures, across every conceivable demographic boundary, into the present day. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what Toho was facing in the early 1960s, and what the Japanese entertainment landscape looked like, and what was happening to cinema globally. As a new medium was eating its lunch with a speed and thoroughness that no amount of institutional denial could slow. Television had arrived in Japan. It arrived with the particular force that television always arrives with in societies that have not yet had it, which is to say it arrived like a restructuring of the available universe of entertainment, a sudden proliferation of content in the domestic space that changed the fundamental calculus of why a family would leave their home and pay money to sit in the darkened room. The Japanese television industry grew with extraordinary speed through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, and as it grew, cinema attendance fell. Not everywhere equally, and not all at once, but in a trend line that was unmistakable and that every studio executive in Japan was staring at with the particular anxiety of someone watching water rise and wondering at what point to move to higher ground. Toho was not uniquely vulnerable to this trend, but it was not immune to it either. And the Godzilla franchise, which had been performing solidly if not spectacularly through its first several entries, was beginning to show the strain of a formula that had not substantially evolved since 1954. The original film's power had depended on novelty as much as on content. The shock of the creature, the shock of the destruction, the shock of a kind of filmmaking that Japanese audiences had not encountered before. By the early 1960s, Toho had made several Godzilla films and several non-Godzilla monster films, and the shock was no longer available. The audience knew what a kaiju film was. They had seen buildings fall before. They had seen the monster rise from the ocean and move through the city and be defeated or not defeated. And the emotional architecture of that experience was no longer surprising enough to reliably fill seats. What Toho needed was a new audience. And the new audience that was most available, most reliable, most enthusiastic about monsters in rubber suits destroying miniature cities, was children, specifically the wave of children who had been born in the post-war baby boom, and who were now reaching the age at which cinema attendance became a family activity, the age at which a parent would take a child to a film, and the child's delight would drive repeat viewings and merchandise purchases, and the kind of passionate, possessive relationship with a fictional property that is the foundation of franchise longevity. The shift did not happen all at once. It happened gradually, across a series of films in the early to mid-1960s, in which the character of Godzilla was incrementally adjusted, his motivations made slightly less opaque, his relationship to human characters made slightly less adversarial. His role in the narrative shifted from pure antagonist toward something more complex. In King Kong vs. Godzilla in 1962, the film was played partly for comedy, which was itself a significant departure from the grave seriousness of Honda's original. In Mothra vs. Godzilla in 1964, Godzilla was still clearly villainous, but the framing around him had become more conventionally adventure-oriented, less interested in the moral weight of destruction. By Ghidorah, the three-headed monster later in 1964, something remarkable had occurred. Godzilla, Mothra, and Rodan, three creatures who had each headlined their own films as threats to humanity, were collaborating to defeat a common enemy. Godzilla was, for the first time, on the side of the humans. The internal logic of this transition was never explained with any consistency. There was no moment in any of these films where the narrative stopped to account for why a creature that had been the embodiment of nuclear apocalypse was now fighting to protect the civilization it had previously been destroying. The film simply proceeded as though the character had always been capable of this, as though the Godzilla who had moved through Honda's burning Tokyo with the indifferent weight of an event rather than a creature was continuous with the Godzilla who was now, more or less, a very large and occasionally grumpy ally. The audience was invited to accept the continuity without examining it too closely, and largely did, because the films that resulted from this repositioning were fun in ways that the earlier films had specifically refused to be. Ishiro Honda directed many of these transitional films, which is one of the more poignant facts in the history of the franchise. The man who had made Gojira as an act of genuine moral seriousness, who had walked through the ruins of Hiroshima and carried that experience into every frame of his monster film, directed the films in which that monster became a figure of entertainment for children. He did this professionally and with evident craft, but there are interviews and accounts from people who knew him in which his ambivalence about the direction is apparent. Honda believed in the original vision. He believed that Godzilla meant something specific and that the specific meaning was more important than the commercial viability of what the character was becoming. He continued making the films because he was a studio director under contract and because the alternative was not making films, but the distance between what he had created and what it was becoming was something he lived with rather than celebrated. The fullest expression of the transformation, the moment at which it became impossible to pretend that the character was still primarily the thing Honda had originally made, came in 1967 with Son of Godzilla. The film introduced Minya, spelled variously in different markets, known in the American dub as Minya, Godzilla's son, or ward, or adopted offspring. The exact nature of the relationship was left productively vague because the exact nature was less important than the fact of it. There was now a small, round, doe-eyed infant version of the world's most terrifying monster, and Godzilla was taking care of it. Minya is, by any objective aesthetic standard, an extraordinary creation. Not extraordinary in the sense of being well-designed or visually coherent. He is neither of those things, being instead a lumpy, large-headed, perpetually bewildered-looking creature, whose relationship to Godzilla's physical design is roughly that of a child's drawing of a thing to the thing itself. He is extraordinary in the sense of being a pure distillation of a commercial intention. Every design choice in Minya points in the same direction, toward the child viewer, toward the instinct to protect and nurture, toward the instinct to protect and nurture, toward the specific emotional frequency of something small and vulnerable that needs a larger, stronger figure to keep it safe. He has enormous eyes. He has stubby, ineffectual limbs. He makes sounds that the dubbing teams in various countries rendered as whimpers and confused squeaks. He cannot produce Godzilla's atomic breath properly. His version comes out as smoke rings, which is either charming or heartbreaking depending on your relationship to the original film. He falls down. He gets scared. He needs to be taught things, and Godzilla teaches him. This is the moment, the specific, particular, irreversible moment, at which the terrifying metaphor became a babysitter. A creature that Honda had built as a vessel for Japan's unprocessed grief about nuclear annihilation was now on screen, coaching a small rubbery child in the fundamentals of monster behavior. There are sequences in Son of Godzilla that are structured exactly like scenes from family films about fathers teaching sons. The larger figure demonstrating a skill, the smaller figure attempting and failing, and attempting again, and attempting again, the larger figure displaying something that the film codes as patience and encouragement. The atomic breath is now a parenting tool. The roar that had silenced cinemas in 1954 is now a form of encouragement directed at an infant. Critics who had taken the original seriously were, as the point summary accurately notes, horrified. The horror was not simply aesthetic snobbery, though there was some of that. It was the horror of watching a thing that had been built to mean something specific be systematically emptied of that meaning and refilled with something much lighter and much more commercially convenient. The nuclear metaphor had not disappeared entirely. It was still there in the franchise's DNA, still present in the character's origin story, still referenced obliquely in various places, but it had been so thoroughly subordinated to the entertainment function that invoking it felt, by the late 1960s, increasingly like pedantry, like insisting at a children's birthday party that the balloons are a symbol of humanity's transient relationship with joy. The children, on the other hand, were delighted. This fact deserves more serious attention than it typically receives in discussions of the franchise's evolution, because the delight was not merely commercial noise, not merely the undiscriminating enthusiasm of an audience too young to know better. The children who fell in love with Godzilla in the late 1960s and early 1970s were responding to something real that the films were actually doing. They were responding to the fantasy of protection, to the fantasy of a creature so large and so powerful that nothing could threaten it, that had chosen, for reasons that were never fully explained and did not need to be, to stand between the small and vulnerable things and the forces that wanted to destroy them. This is not a trivial fantasy. It is, in fact, one of the oldest and most persistent fantasies in human storytelling, present in mythologies and fairy tales and religious narratives across every culture. The powerful protector, the guardian too mighty to be defeated, the force of strength that is also a force of care. What the Godzilla franchise stumbled into in the late 1960s, through the unglamorous mechanism of commercial desperation and audience, see demographic targeting, was an accidental alignment with this archetype. Manila was not sophisticated. Son of Godzilla was not a great film by any standard that applies to the word great, but the emotional structure it was tapping into. The child watching a father defend his son, the child watching something enormous choose gentleness, was ancient and genuine, and resonant in ways that no amount of critical disdain could dissolve. The children who watched these films became adults who remembered them, not with the qualified appreciation of someone acknowledging a guilty pleasure, but with a warmth that is structural, embedded in the way the films had first been experienced, at an age when the distinction between the thing and the feeling the thing produced was not yet fully operational. These adults became the audience for the franchise's later iterations. They became the parents who took their own children to see Godzilla films. They became the people who, when the Monsterverse positioned Godzilla as Earth's defender, felt a recognition that was not intellectual but physical, felt it in the part of themselves that had been 7 years old watching a monster choose to protect something smaller than itself. The babysitter had created a legacy. The terrifying metaphor had, through its commercial humiliation, accidentally produced something more durable than terror, attachment. You can stop being afraid of something. You do not stop loving something you loved when you were 7. Honda understood this eventually, or came to a peace with it that resembled understanding. There are accounts of him in his later years describing the children's films not as failures but as a different kind of success, as having done something for a different audience that the original had done for its audience, which was to create a vessel large enough to hold something that mattered. To people, what mattered to the children was not what had mattered to the survivors. But what mattered to the children mattered genuinely. And the creature that held it was, despite everything, still his creature. Still the thing he had made from grief and seriousness and the walk through Hiroshima's ruins. Transformed beyond recognition, perhaps, emptied of the specific content he had put into it certainly, but still standing, still enormous, still in its new and unrecognizable way, meaning something to somebody. There is a frame of analysis in which the villain becoming a father is a simple story of commercial compromise, of art being subordinated to commerce, of a serious work being progressively stripped of seriousness in the service of market expansion. This frame is not wrong. Every element of the transition from the 1954 film to Son of Godzilla can be accurately described in these terms, and the description is damning. But there is another frame, one that becomes available only from the distance of several decades, in which the transformation is something stranger and more interesting than simple compromise, in which the creature's adaptability, its capacity to absorb radically different meanings without losing its essential recognizability, is itself evidence of a kind of mythic depth that purely serious, purely metaphorical constructions rarely achieve. The great mythic figures of human storytelling are not fixed. They are contested, revised, pulled in opposite directions by different needs and different historical moments. Hercules is terrifying and Hercules is comic, and Hercules is a children's cartoon character, and Hercules is a symbol of masculine virtue, and Hercules is a cautionary tale about masculine excess. These versions do not cancel each other out. They accumulate. They create a figure large enough to hold contradictions, ancient enough to have been many things to many people, durable enough to survive each individual transformation, because it is not dependent on any single one. Godzilla had become, through the awkward commercial decisions of the 1960s, something like this. Not intentionally, not through the application of any grand unified theory of monster mythology, but through the accident of a character who was visually distinctive enough to remain recognizable through radical reinvention, whose original meaning was serious enough to generate critical engagement, and whose new meaning was emotionally accessible enough to generate mass attachment. The critics who were horrified by Manila were right. The children who were delighted by Manila were right. Both responses were accurate readings of what the films were doing. Both located genuine truths about the transformation and what it cost and what it created. The horror was the appropriate response to what had been lost. The delight was the appropriate response to what had been found. And the franchise that held both responses, that could be simultaneously a subject of scholarly analysis and a beloved memory from somebody's childhood, a serious metaphor for nuclear anxiety, and a source of joy for a 7-year-old watching a smoke ring, was larger than either response alone. The terrifying metaphor became a babysitter, and the babysitter, against all critical expectation, against all the evidence of what had been sacrificed to make him one, turned out to be one of the most important things Godzilla ever became, because the children he babysat never forgot him. And when they grew up, they brought him with them. 9 years is a long time to leave a monster in the water. When Toho released Terror of Mechagodzilla in 1975, it was not presented as a farewell. There was no announcement that the franchise was ending. No formal acknowledgement that the era of Godzilla films that had run continuously since 1954 was being closed. The film simply performed poorly. Poorly enough that Toho's internal calculus shifted, quietly and without ceremony, from the question of what the next Godzilla film would be, to the question of whether there would be a next Godzilla film at all. The answer for 9 years was no. The monster that had been born from Japan's unprocessed nuclear grief, that had been softened into a children's hero, that had fought increasingly absurd enemies in increasingly colorful films for increasingly young audiences, was retired without fanfare and without eulogy. He went back into the water. Japan moved on, or appeared to. The appearance of moving on is one of the things Japan had become exceptionally practiced at by the mid-1970s. The post-war economic miracle had produced a country that looked from certain angles like it had processed its history successfully, had taken the devastation of the war and the occupation and the atomic bombings and transformed them, through sheer productive energy, into the second largest economy in the world. The reconstruction was real. The prosperity was real. The bullet trains and the consumer electronics and the urban density and the extraordinary efficiency of a society that had rebuilt itself from rubble in less than 3 decades. All of it was real and remarkable and genuinely achieved. But underneath the achievement, the history had not gone anywhere. It had not been resolved. It had been in the way of things that cannot be resolved, accumulated, layered over with the successive sediment of decades of forward motion, of economic growth and political stability, and the general project of being a modern nation with modern concerns. The grief that Honda had put into Gojira in 1954 had not been discharged by the franchise's evolution into children's entertainment. It had simply been covered, and covered things, in the geology of national psychology, as in actual geology, have a tendency to surface when the pressure builds sufficiently. The pressure had been building. The 9 years of Godzilla's absence from screens were not 9 years of Japanese stability and uncomplicated prosperity. They were 9 years of significant anxiety about the thing that had always, since 1945, been the background frequency of Japanese life: nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and Japan's peculiar, agonized, unavoidable relationship with both. The 1970s had seen the global anti-nuclear movement grow substantially, and in Japan, with its specific historical reasons for anti-nuclear sentiment, the movement had particular force and particular complexity. Japan was constitutionally prohibited from developing nuclear weapons. It was simultaneously dependent on nuclear power for a significant portion of its energy needs. It was geographically positioned in a region where multiple nuclear-armed powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, maintained arsenals and conducted policies that could, in various scenarios, result in Japan being in the vicinity of nuclear conflict again. The Japanese public's relationship to this situation was not one of resolved acceptance. It was one of sustained, largely unspoken, collectively managed dread. Then came November 1979, and 3 Mile Island, and the partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania that released radioactive gases into the surrounding environment, and came, by the later assessment of investigators, closer to a full-core meltdown than the official statements at the time acknowledged. 3 Mile Island did not directly affect Japan. It was an American incident at an American plant, but it rippled through the global conversation about nuclear power with a force that no amount of official reassurance could fully contain. Because what it demonstrated was that the technology that had been presented as safe and controlled and managed by competent professionals was capable of failing in ways that the competent professionals had not fully anticipated and could not fully control. The gap between official confidence and actual safety was suddenly visibly measurable. For Japan, this gap was not a new discovery. It was a confirmation of something the country had understood at the cellular level since 1945, that nuclear energy in all its forms was a thing that could escape the containers built to hold it, could move beyond the boundaries of the zones designated for its deployment, could arrive without warning in the bodies of people who had been told they were safe. 3 Mile Island was not Hiroshima, but it spoke the same language, and Japan heard it. Into this context, this accumulated, layered, inadequately processed anxiety about nuclear technology and nuclear risk, this 9-year absence of the cultural figure that had once served as its vessel, came Tomoyuki Tanaka, the producer who had conceived the original Gojira 30 years earlier, who had spent the intervening decades watching what his creation had become and was now, in the early 1980s, determined to make it mean something again. Tanaka was not a young man by this point. He was in his late 60s, and he had watched the franchise he had originated become something that he had not intended, and that he believed had run its course. The children's films had served their commercial purpose, But their commercial purpose was exhausted. The audience they had been made for had grown up, and the new generation of children had other options, other monsters, other franchises competing for their attention. The Godzilla brand was not dead, but it was diminished. It had the specific diminishment of something that had the specific diminishment of something that had been made safe, which is that safety had made it small. You cannot simultaneously be the embodiment of nuclear terror and a character who appears on children's lunchboxes without paying a cost, and the franchise had been paying that cost for 15 years. What Tanaka wanted was to stop paying it. What he wanted was to go back, not to 1954 exactly, because 1954 was not recoverable, but because the audience of 1984 was not the audience of 1954, and the world of 1984 was not the world of 1954, but back to the emotional and moral seriousness of the original vision, back to the monster as a thing to be genuinely afraid of, rather than a thing to be fondly entertained by. Back to Godzilla as a force of nature, rather than a personality. Back to the weight. He assembled a team that understood this intention. Koji Hashimoto was hired to direct, a choice that communicated something about priorities, since Hashimoto was not a director with a strong auteurist reputation, but was understood to be technically capable and responsive to the vision of the producer above him. The screenplay went through multiple iterations in which the central challenge was always the same. How do you bring back a character who has spent 15 years being comic and gentle and child-friendly and restore to him the quality of existential threat without simply pretending the intervening films didn't happen? The solution the filmmakers arrived at was elegant in its simplicity. They didn't pretend the intervening films didn't happen. They ignored them entirely. The 1984 film, titled in Japan simply Gojira, the 1984 film, titled in Japan simply Gojira, the same title as the 1954 original, the same deliberate austerity, positioned itself as a direct sequel to the 1954 film, and only to the 1954 film. Everything between 1955 and 1975, all the space monsters and children's adventures and smoke ring blowing infant sidekicks, was not acknowledged, not wrenched, not argued against. It was simply set aside, as though the decision to set it aside were the most natural thing in the world. This was, in terms of franchise management, a move of some audacity. It required the audience to accept a continuity that skipped 30 years of films they had actually seen, to agree to remember only the first film, and to treat everything after it as something that had not occurred. That the audience largely accepted this. That the 1984 film was received, in Japan, as a genuine continuation of the original, rather than as an exercise in selective franchise memory, says something about how ready the audience was for the specific thing the film was offering. They did not need to be persuaded that the children's films had not been the real Godzilla. They already felt it. They had always felt it, at some level, had always maintained, alongside whatever affection the later films generated, a separate and more serious relationship with the original creature, the one that meant something, the one that Honda had made from grief. The 1984 Godzilla was built to honor that separate relationship. He was, physically, different from the versions that had appeared through the 1960s and 1970s. The suit was redesigned with significant attention to restoring the qualities that the original design had possessed, and the later ones had progressively softened. The face was made less expressive, less readable, the eyes smaller and more deeply set. The overall physiognomy shifted away from the almost mammalian expressiveness that the children's era suits had cultivated towards something more reptilian, more opaque, more genuinely alien. The creature that appeared on screen in 1984 did not have a face you could read. It did not communicate intention or emotion in the way that the Showa-era suits had communicated them. It was, in the most precise sense, a see rather than a character, something that moved through the world according to principles that were not human principles and could not be negotiated with or appealed to or understood. The scale was increased. The 1984 Godzilla was 80 meters tall, larger than any previous version. larger than the original's 50 meters, larger in a way that was meant to be felt as well as measured. The miniature sets were constructed with corresponding attention to detail and density. Tokyo rendered with enough specificity that its destruction carried the weight of something real being lost rather than something generic being demolished. Tsuburaya was gone. He had died in 1970, but his legacy was present in the approach of the special effects team, which returned to the fundamental philosophy of suitmation, not as a limitation but as a choice, as the technique most capable of producing the specific quality of weight and inevitability that the film required. The film's narrative stripped away almost everything that the Showa era had accumulated. There were no other monsters. There was no alien invasion, no space enemy requiring Godzilla's unlikely assistance, no Mothra arriving to deliver exposition through tiny singing women. There was only the creature and the city, and the question of what could be done. The human characters were not heroes in the adventure film sense, but officials and scientists and soldiers operating within recognizable institutional structures: the Japanese government, the military, international diplomatic channels, and the film was interested in the specific texture of institutional response to a crisis that institutions are not designed to manage. Cabinet meetings were depicted. Chain of command questions were addressed. The bureaucratic machinery of a modern state confronting something that bureaucratic machinery cannot process was rendered with an attention to procedural reality that grounded the film's fantastic elements in something that felt, uncomfortably, like the real world. The Cold War was embedded in the film's structure in ways that went beyond subtext. The 1984 film depicted the United States and the Soviet Union, each attempting to use Godzilla's presence as an occasion for advancing their strategic interests. The Soviets threatening a nuclear strike, the Americans maneuvering diplomatically to prevent it while pursuing their own agenda. Japan was positioned, as it had been in reality since 1945, as the country caught between nuclear powers, the country whose territory and whose people were the potential casualties of decisions made in Washington and Moscow. This was not allegory. This was a reasonably accurate description of Japan's actual geopolitical situation in 1984, rendered in the context of a monster film with a directness that Honda's original had not quite managed, and that the children's films had not attempted at all. The Soviet nuclear threat, a subplot in which a Soviet submarine prepares to launch a nuclear missile at Godzilla from Tokyo Bay, and in which the missile is accidentally launched and must be intercepted, was added partly at the insistence of the American co-production partners who bought into the film for the Western release. It was a moment of genuine tension within the production about the film's political content, about how directly it should engage with the nuclear anxiety that was its primary emotional material. The Japanese filmmakers had wanted to keep the focus on Godzilla as a natural disaster, as a force of nature requiring a natural disaster response. The American partners wanted the geopolitical thriller elements that would make the film more immediately legible to Western audiences. The compromise produced a film that was sometimes in tension with itself, that moved between the almost meditative quality of a disaster film and the more kinetic rhythms of a Cold War thriller, without always successfully integrating the two modes. But the tension was not without productive consequence. The accidental Soviet nuclear launch, the near miss, the horror of nuclear weapons nearly being deployed on Japanese soil again, landed differently in Japan than it might have in a Western context. For Japanese audiences, this was not a thriller beat, it was a nightmare that was also a memory, a scenario that connected backward to 1945 and forward to every subsequent year of living in the geographic and political vicinity of nuclear arsenals. The film was not subtle about this connection. It did not need to be. The audience made it without prompting, felt it in the gut rather than the intellect, recognized in the narrative's near miss, the shape of the near miss that Japanese history had been since the end of the war, the continuous precarious condition of a country that had experienced nuclear attack, and had spent the subsequent decades hoping, without any structural guarantee, that it would not experience it again. Japan was ready to feel afraid again, because Japan had never stopped being afraid. The 9 years of Godzilla's absence had not been 9 years of resolved anxiety. They had been 9 years in which the anxiety had no designated cultural vessel, no agreed-upon form in which it could be acknowledged and processed. The 1984 film provided the vessel again. It said with the seriousness and directness that the children's films had abandoned. The thing you are afraid of is real. It is real, and it is enormous, and it cannot be reasoned with, and it will not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, and there is no technology adequate to contain it. You are right to be afraid. You have always been right to be afraid. The film was a meme, a sigh of commercial success in Japan. It outperformed every Godzilla film since the original, selling approximately 3 million tickets in its domestic run and demonstrating with considerable clarity that the audience Tanaka had been hoping to reach, the adult Japanese audience that had grown up with the franchise, that remembered the original or had come to it through the cultural weight it carried, that had been waiting for the creature to be taken seriously again, was real and large and hungry for exactly what the film was offering. The American version, released in 1985, as Godzilla 1985, repeated the pattern established in 1956. New footage was added featuring an American actor, Raymond Burr, returning to his role of Steve Martin 30 years later, providing narration and American perspective on events that had been constructed for a Japanese audience with Japanese concerns. The addition was not as damaging as the 1956 intervention had been. The 1984 film was more conventionally structured than Honda's original, more legible within Western genre conventions, and the cuts required to accommodate the new material were less consequential. But the pattern itself was telling. 30 years after King of the Monsters, the American instinct was still to add a reporter, still to provide the external observer, still to frame Japan's nuclear anxiety as an event to be narrated from outside, rather than a wound to be witnessed from within. The monster that returned in 1984 was not identical to the monster Honda had made in 1954. It could not be. Honda's monster had been made from the specific raw material of a specific historical moment, from the Lucky Dragon 5 still fresh in the newspapers, from the Hayabusa still walking through daily life, from the American occupation barely 2 years ended. The 1984 monster was made from memory, from the recognition that the original had been right about something, from the adult perspective of a culture looking back at a film it had made in grief and understanding, perhaps for the first time fully, what the grief had been about and why it had needed that particular shape. This is a different kind of seriousness than Honda's. It is the seriousness of retrospect, rather than the seriousness of immediate wound. It is the seriousness of a culture that has had 30 years to process what it was feeling in 1954, and has discovered that the processing is incomplete, that the wound is still there beneath the prosperity and the reconstruction in the children's films, that the monster was right to be a monster, and that making him into something gentler had been a commercial necessity and nothing more. Japan was ready to feel afraid again because fear in this context was not only unpleasant, it was honest. It was the appropriate response to a world in which nuclear weapons still existed, in which nuclear reactors could still fail, in which the geopolitical arrangements that kept those weapons from being used were arrangements made by human beings operating under human limitations, in conditions of human uncertainty. The children's films had offered comfort. The 1984 film offered truth. And after 9 years of absence, after a decade of living with the anxiety and having no designated place to put it, the audience chose truth. He came back from the water cold and dark and enormous, stripped of everything that had been added to make him safe. And Japan looked at him and felt, underneath the fear, something that was almost relief. The real thing had returned. The real thing had been there all along, waiting in the 9-year silence, patient in the way that forces of nature are patient, which is to say without patience at all, simply present, simply real. Simply the thing it had always been beneath every author. Our thing it had been made into, simply the wound. Still open. Still walking. There is a specific kind of failure that is worse than ordinary failure. A kind that requires more talent and more money and more visible effort than ordinary failure. a kind that requires more talent and more money and more visible effort than ordinary failure, a kind that requires more talent and more money and more visible effort than ordinary failure, a kind that requires more talent and more money and more visible effort than ordinary failure, and that produces, precisely because of the talent and money and effort invested in it, a result more completely wrong than simple incompetence could have achieved. Simple incompetence produces bad films. The particular combination of ambition, misunderstanding, and industrial overconfidence that Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin brought to their 1998 Godzilla produced something rarer and more instructive. A film that was wrong in every direction simultaneously, that managed to misunderstand not just the source material, but the nature of the misunderstanding, that got the monster wrong, and the tone wrong, and the scale wrong, and the meaning wrong, in ways that revealed with uncomfortable precision exactly what Hollywood in the late 1990s was and was not capable of seeing when it looked at something it did not make. To understand the 1998 film fully, you have to understand the specific moment of Hollywood history in which it was conceived and greenlit and produced, because that moment shaped every decision the film made in ways that its creators were probably not fully aware of, and certainly never fully acknowledged. The mid-90s were the years of the event film, the years in which studios had discovered, or rediscovered, or finally fully committed to the discovery that a certain kind of large-scale effects-driven, high-concept entertainment could generate not just strong box office, but cultural saturation, the kind of omnipresence that turned a film into an event that people felt they needed to participate in, simply to remain current. Independence Day, which Emmerich and Devlin had made in 1996, was the template and the proof of concept. It had earned over $800 million worldwide. It had featured enormous destructive spectacle, broadly drawn characters delivering quotable lines, a narrative that moved with the efficiency of a machine designed specifically to deliver escalating set pieces, and a relationship to genuine emotional or intellectual weight that was essentially decorative, present enough to provide the set pieces with nominal stakes, absent enough to never slow anything down. Independence Day had not been trying to be Gojira. It had been trying to be Independence Day, and it had succeeded completely. The problem arose when Emmerich and Devlin, flush with that success, and handed the Godzilla license by TriStar Pictures, applied the Independence Day methodology to material that was not Independence Day material. The problem arose from the assumption that what worked for a story about alien invasion would work for a story about nuclear consequence, that the event film toolkit was universal, that scale and spectacle and a quick-moving plot with a likable protagonist were the variables that determined whether an audience would engage, regardless of what the underlying material was or what it had originally been made to do. This assumption was not unreasonable given their professional experience. It was simply wrong. The film they made began with the correct ingredients and assembled them into something that shared no essential properties with the original. There was a monster. The monster destroyed buildings. These three facts were the entirety of what the 1998 Godzilla shared with Honda's 1954 film, and they were the three least important facts about Honda's 1954 film. Everything that actually mattered. The weight, the grief, the nuclear subtext, the indifferent destructive force that could not be reasoned with, or outrun, or made into an adventure. The creature that moved through the world as a consequence rather than an antagonist, was absent, not cut as King of the Monsters had cut it, never present, never considered, possibly never understood to be the thing that needed considering. The creature design is the most immediately visible evidence of the fundamental misunderstanding. The 1998 Godzilla is a theropod, a large bipedal, vaguely tyrannosaur-shaped animal with lean musculature, a pointed snout, and the general physiognomy of something that might plausibly exist within the framework of natural history if you scaled up a lizard sufficiently and added nuclear mutation as a handwave explanation for the scaling. It moves quickly. It burrows. It reproduces asexually in the Madison Square Garden sequence. laying hundreds of eggs that hatch into smaller versions of itself, creating the conditions for a different kind of film. A siege film, a survival horror film, an aliens-influenced action sequence in an enclosed space. That has almost nothing to do with why any version of Godzilla had ever existed. The design was deliberate and was defended publicly by its creators on the grounds of plausibility, the argument being that a real creature of Godzilla's dimensions would need to be built along certain biomechanical lines to function, and that the traditional Godzilla design with its upright posture and heavy tail and relatively small forelimbs was biomechanically implausible at that scale. This argument has a certain narrow technical validity and a complete aesthetic wrongness. Biomechanical plausibility is not what Godzilla is for. Godzilla is not an exercise in speculative zoology. He is not an attempt to imagine what a nuclear mutated dinosaur might actually look like if the constraints of physics were applied rigorously. He is a shape given to grief, and the shape matters because it carries the wag, hut of what it was made to carry, and the specific upright tail-dragging, small-armed, thick-necked shape of the original Godzilla carries that weight in ways that the lean theropod of the 1998 film does not and cannot. The upright posture makes him human-adjacent without being human. The thick neck and heavy skull make him geological, something formed by pressure over time. The small arms make him not a predator in the conventional sense, not a creature optimized for hunting, but something that destroys as a condition of its existence, rather than as a behavioral choice. The tail that drags behind him is the tail of something so large it cannot fully manage its own dimensions, something whose scale exceeds its own control. Every element of the original design communicates something about what the creature is and what it means. The 1998 design communicates that the creature could theoretically run fast and catch things. This is not nothing, as a design brief. It is simply the wrong brief entirely. Matthew Broderick was cast as the film's protagonist, a scientist named Nico Totopoulos, a name that the film appeared to find amusing, deploying it with a frequency that suggested the writers considered its foreignness a source of gentle comedy. Broderick was a genuinely talented actor who had spent the previous decade demonstrating considerable charm and intelligence in a range of films. He was wrong for this role not because of any personal deficiency, but because of what his screen persona represented. A specific quality of likable, slightly bumbling, fundamentally unthreatened American competence that was exactly the quality a Godzilla film needed to not have. Broderick's character in Ferris Bueller's Day Off survives everything through charm and luck and the universe's apparent willingness to arrange itself around his comfort. This is a wonderful quality in a comedy about a teenager skipping school. It is a catastrophic quality in a film about nuclear consequence. Because nuclear consequence does not arrange itself around anyone's comfort, does not respond to charm, does not allow the likable protagonist to be fundamentally unthreatened. The quips are the symptom, not the disease. When critics and audiences cite the Matthew Broderick quips as emblematic of what went wrong, they are identifying the most visible surface expression of a much deeper structural problem. The quips exist because the film understood its own monster as an obstacle, rather than a force, as a problem to be solved by a protagonist rather than a reality to be endured by people. When your monster is an obstacle, quips are appropriate. They are the language of protagonists overcoming obstacles, the verbal evidence that the hero is not overwhelmed, that the situation is manageable, that we will get through this. When your monster is nuclear consequence, quips are not appropriate because nuclear consequence is not manageable, and the appropriate response to it is not reassuring competence, but something closer to the helpless, specific, unglamorous terror that Honda's human characters had embodied in 1954, the terror of people who understood that the thing coming toward them was not an obstacle, but a verdict. The film was commercially successful by the standards of ordinary films. It earned $379 million worldwide on a budget of approximately $130 million, which by most accounting constitutes a financial success. By the standards of what it had been expected to achieve, what TriStar had paid for the license expecting to achieve, what the marketing campaign's saturation level ambition had implied would be achieved. It was a significant underperformance. Independence Day had earned more than double this figure. The critical reception was hostile. The audience response was, more damagingly, indifferent. People went, as they had been conditioned by the marketing to go, and came out neither devastated nor exhilarated but simply emptied, having spent 2 hours in the presence of expensive effects and no particular reason to care about any of them. But the American commercial disappointment is the least interesting part of the story. The most interesting part is what happened in Japan. Toho had been involved in the production in a limited consultative capacity and had watched the results with a response that moved through several stages, from concern during production to dismay at the finished film to something that can only be described, given what they subsequently did, as cold institutional fury. The fury was not about money, though the film's underperformance had financial implications for the franchise. It was about meaning. It was about the specific, intolerable sight of something that had been made from Japan's deepest historical wound being turned, by people who had never understood what it was made from, into a film about a large fast lizard being chased through Manhattan by Matthew Broderick while making quips. Toho's response was formal and precise, and, in its precision, more devastating than any amount of public criticism could have been. They designated the 1998 creature a separate entity from Godzilla. They gave it its own name, Zilla. The renaming was explained in various official Toho statements and interviews with executives, with a directness that left nothing ambiguous. The American film, they said, had taken the god out of Godzilla. The creature it had created was not Godzilla. It shared a name and a general body plan, and nothing else of significance. It was something lesser, something that moved fast and laid eggs and was killed by the military, with conventional weapons, something that did not carry the weight that Godzilla carried because the weight was the specific thing its creators had not understood, and had therefore not included. You cannot accidentally make something carry weight. It was not built to carry. You cannot make something mean something through the application of sufficient budget. The god had been removed and what remained was only Zilla, and Zilla was not worthy of what had been removed from it. The formal, definitive, operationally complete expression of this judgment came in 2004, in Godzilla, Final Wars, a film Toho made to celebrate the franchise's 50th anniversary. A film that was in many ways excessive and sometimes incoherent, but that contained one moment of such perfect, compressed, institutional clarity that it transcended the film around it, and became the statement Toho had been building toward since 1998. Godzilla encounters Zilla. The encounter lasts approximately 3 seconds of screen time. Zilla charges. Godzilla deflects him with minimal effort, blasts him with atomic breath, and kills him without breaking stride. The camera does not linger. Godzilla moves on, having dispatched the American pretender with the same indifference one might apply to removing a minor inconvenience from one's path. The scene had no dramatic function within the film's narrative. Zilla was not a significant villain. His defeat advanced nothing. His presence in the film existed for one reason only, which was to make this statement on screen, with the full weight of Toho's institutional authority behind it. This is what Godzilla is, and this is what Godzilla does to things that are not Godzilla. The 3 seconds of screen time were not contemptuous in the casual sense. They were contemptuous in the careful, considered, precisely calibrated sense of an organization that had thought about exactly how much scurrar and time the American version deserved, and had determined the answer was 3 seconds because 3 seconds was still 1 second more than it merited. The director of Final Wars, Ryuhei Kitamura, was reportedly enthusiastic about the scene and the speed of it, specifically the speed. The insistence that the encounter be brief to the point of dismissiveness. There had apparently been discussions about giving the fight more screen time, about allowing it to breathe slightly, and these discussions had been resolved in favor of maximum brevity on the grounds that any additional time would imply a level of competition between the creatures that was not warranted. Zilla was not Godzilla's equal. Zilla was not Godzilla's opponent. Zilla was the thing that happened when you removed the god, and the appropriate amount of Godzilla's time to spend on it was the minimum physically possible, within the constraints of having it appear on screen at all. The American audience's relationship to the 1998 film has evolved in interesting ways in the decades since its release. There is a contingent, vocal online, as all contingents are vocal online, for whom the film is a guilty pleasure, an object of ironic affection, something to be enjoyed in the full awareness of its wrongness. This is not an illegitimate relationship to have with a bad film, and it produces genuine enjoyment in the people who have it. There is also a smaller contingent that argues the film has been unfairly maligned, that taken on its own terms as a blockbuster creature feature, it is adequately competent, that the hatred directed at it derives from the unfair burden of expectation that the Godzilla name placed on it. This argument contains a grain of truth wrapped around a fundamental error. The grain of truth is that assessed purely as a late 1990s blockbuster, independent of its relationship to the source matter. The 1998 film is not dramatically worse than many other late 1990s blockbusters that have not attracted comparable opprobrium. The fundamental error is the phrase independent of its relationship to the source material, because there is no version of the 1998 Godzilla that exists independent of its relationship to the source material. The film used the name. The film used the license. The film presented itself to audiences as Godzilla and collected the cultural capital that the name carried, the decades of meaning, the accumulated weight of the franchise, the specific gravity of what Honda had made in 1954. Having collected that capital, it is not available to be assessed without reference to what the capital represented. You cannot spend the inheritance and then argue that your financial situation should be evaluated independently of the inheritance. What the 1998 film revealed, more clearly than any critical analysis could have stated, was the precise shape of what Hollywood in the 1990s could not see when it looked at Godzilla. It could see the spectacle, it could see the creature and the destruction and the commercial potential of a recognizable brand applied to the kind of large-scale effects film that was then dominating the global box office. It could not see the grief. It could not see the history. It could not see the specific weight that the original creature carried or understand why that weight was not optional, why removing it did not produce a lighter, more commercially agile version of the same thing, but produced a categorically different thing that shared only the surface with what it claimed to be. This blindness was not malicious. Emmerich and Devlin were not attempting to desecrate something they understood and loved. They were attempting to make a successful blockbuster using material they believed they understood and demonstrably did not. The misunderstanding was complete, and in its completeness, almost innocent. The innocence of people who look at a complex thing and see only its most visible dimension, who look at Godzilla and see a large monster that destroys cities without seeing a nation's attempt to make its grief large enough to look at directly. The 3 seconds in Final Wars are the answer to that innocence. They are Toho saying, with the economy and precision that great filmmaking occasionally achieves, "We see what you saw, and we see what you missed, and the distance between what you saw and what you missed is exactly the distance between Zilla and Godzilla, which is the distance between a creature and a meaning, between a body and the wound the body was made from, between a film that cost $130 million and a film that cost a fraction of that and told the truth. The god had been taken out, and Japan put it back, in 3 seconds with atomic breath without breaking stride. Without a quip in sight. The real thing moved on. It had somewhere to be, something to mean, a weight to carry that the other had never been built to carry, and that no amount of budget or spectacle or franchise ambition could manufacture from scratch. You cannot buy the weight. You have to have been there when the ash fell, on March 11th, 2011, at 2:46 in the afternoon. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the Pacific coast of Japan's Tohoku region. generating a tsunami that reached heights of up to 40 meters in some locations and traveled up to 10 kilometers inland. The wave killed approximately 15,900 people. It destroyed or damaged over 1 million buildings. It swept entire towns into the ocean with a completeness that made the subsequent search for survivors a search through absence, through places where streets had been and were no longer, where houses had stood and left no evidence of standing, where the ordinary infrastructure of human life had been removed so thoroughly that the landscape it left behind looked less like a disaster zone than like a place where human habitation had never occurred. And then, as the water receded and the scale of the destruction was still being measured, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant began to fail. 3 of the plant's 6 reactors suffered meltdowns in the days following the earthquake and tsunami. Hydrogen explosions damaged the reactor buildings. Radioactive material was released into the atmosphere and into the ocean. A 20-kilometer exclusion zone was established around the plant, and approximately 150,000 people were evacuated from their homes. Homes that many of them would not return to for years, and some would never return to at all. The Japanese government's initial public communications about the severity of the situation were incomplete and, in some cases, actively misleading. TEPCO, the utility company operating the plant, was slow to acknowledge the extent of the damage and slower still to provide the information that emergency responders and the public needed to make informed decisions about safety. The gap between what was happening inside the damaged reactors and what was being said publicly about what was happening inside the damaged reactors was wide, and the people living in the vicinity of the plant were making decisions about whether to stay or leave, whether to send their children to school or keep them home, whether the food they were eating and the water they were drinking was safe, on the basis of official statements that were not reliable. Japan had been here before, not at Fukushima specifically, but in the general territory of nuclear disaster inadequately communicated by authorities who prioritized institutional self-protection over public information. The country had been here in 1954 when the government's response to the Lucky Dragon 5 incident had been shaped more by diplomatic considerations than by the medical needs of the irradiated crew. It had been here in 1945, when the American occupation had suppressed information about the medical effects of radiation on the Hibakusha. Japan's relationship with nuclear disaster was inseparable from Japan's relationship with institutional failure, with the specific recurring pattern of authorities knowing more than they were saying, of the gap between official reassurance and actual risk being discovered only after decisions had been made that could not be unmade. Fukushima did not kill as many people as Hiroshima. It did not irradiate as many people as Nagasaki. By the metrics of pure physical damage, it was a different order of catastrophe than the events that had given birth to Godzilla in 1954. But it reopened the wound in ways that were not about metrics. It reopened the wound because it demonstrated, with devastating clarity, that the things Japan had feared since 1945, that nuclear technology was not fully controllable, that official assurances about nuclear safety could not be fully trusted, that the consequences of nuclear failure did not respect the boundaries drawn around them, were not historical anxieties that had been superseded by modernity and engineering progress. They were current realities. They were happening now, in the present tense, on Japanese soil, to Japanese people, managed by Japanese institutions, that were failing in ways that felt familiar, because they were familiar, because they reproduced the structure of every previous institutional failure Japan had experienced in the context of nuclear events. Hideaki Anno was 50 years old when Fukushima happened. He had spent his career making work that engaged, with extraordinary directness and at considerable personal cost, with the specific texture of Japanese psychological crisis, with the way that individual psychological collapse and institutional failure and cultural stagnation reinforced each other, with the way that trauma expressed itself in systems as well as in people. Neon Genesis Evangelion, the animated television series he had created in the mid-90s, was ostensibly a story about giant robots fighting alien monsters. It was actually a story about clinical depression, about the failure of authority figures, about the impossibility of genuine human connection, about the specific Japanese cultural pathologies of institutional rigidity and emotional repression, and the violence done to individuals by systems that prioritized function over humanity. It had been made from Anno's own breakdown, and had broken down itself partway through its production. Its final episodes replacing conventional narrative with something closer to experimental psychological documentation. Characters sitting in white space, examining their own thoughts, the animation budget visibly collapsing under the weight of what the work was trying to do. Evangelion had been enormously influential and was understood by the Japanese audience that grew up with it as something more than entertainment, as a cultural document that said true things about what it felt like to be Japanese at the end of the 20th century, about the specific costs of the specific ways Japan had organized itself and its people. When Anno agreed, in 2012, to direct a new Godzilla film for Toho, the people who understood his work understood that the result would not be a conventional franchise entry. They understood that Anno would bring to Godzilla what he brought to everything: the willingness to make the audience genuinely uncomfortable, to refuse the consolations of conventional narrative structure, to use the surface material as a vehicle for something much more direct and much more difficult than the surface material typically permitted. What he made, released in July 2016 as Shin Godzilla. The word Shin meaning new, or true, or God, self-it, carrying all three meanings simultaneously, with a deliberateness that is entirely Anno, was the most political Godzilla film ever made, and by a considerable margin, the most terrifying Godzilla film since Honda's original. The terror operated on two levels simultaneously, and the two levels were inseparable from each other in ways that were entirely intentional. The first level was Godzilla himself, the physical creature, the design, the way he moved, and what he did when he moved. The second level was the Japanese government, the institutions, the procedures, the meetings, the chain of command, the gap between what the situation required and what the system was capable of providing. Anno constructed these two levels in parallel. Cutting between them with a rhythm that was not the rhythm of conventional action cinema, but something closer to the rhythm of documentary, of footage assembled to demonstrate a thesis rather than to provide an experience. The Bureau. Racy sequences are the element of Shin Godzilla that most surprised Western audiences, and that most completely expressed what the film was doing. They are long. They are detailed. They follow the Japanese government's response to the initial Godzilla emergence through meeting after meeting, committee after committee, briefing after committee, briefing after briefing, in which information moves slowly through hierarchical channels, in which decisions require approval from multiple layers of authority, in which the question of who has jurisdiction over the response delays the response itself, in which the system's internal logic, the logic of institutional self-preservation, of procedural correctness, of not acting until authorized to act, operates with perfect efficiency toward catastrophically inefficient results. Anno shot these sequences with a visual grammar borrowed from political drama and documentary, handheld cameras, tight shots on faces, rapid cutting between speakers, the rooms and corridors of government, rendered in the specific aesthetic of institutional reality, rather than cinematic approximation. The characters speak in the actual language of Japanese bureaucracy, in the specific vocabulary of government procedure that Japanese audiences recognized immediately, and Western audiences required subtitle notes to fully decode. The jokes, and there are jokes that land differently depending on whether you have experienced the specific frustration of Japanese institutional culture from the inside. For Japanese audiences, they landed as something between comedy and horror, the comedy of recognition, of seeing your lived experience rendered with perfect accuracy on screen, and the horror of recognizing that what is being rendered accurately is a system that cannot respond adequately, is a system that requires immediate, unconstrained, hierarchically unencumbered action. Fukushima was not absent from these sequences. It was present in every frame, the specific failures that Anno was depicting, the delayed acknowledgement of severity, the prioritization of institutional messaging over public information, the committees convened to decide whether a committee should be convened, were the failures that had occurred in the government and corporate response to the nuclear disaster 5 years earlier. Anno was not making allegory. He was making documentation, rendered as fiction because fiction could say directly what documentary, in the specific political climate of 2016 Japan, could not say as directly. He was making the Godzilla film that Honda would have made if Honda had lived to see Fukushima. The film in which the monster was inseparable from the institutional failure that allowed the monster to cause as much damage as it caused. The creature Anno designed with effects director Shinji Higuchi was the most radical reimagining of Godzilla's physical form since the original, and it was radical in a direction exactly opposite to the 1998 film's radicalism, where Emmerich had made Godzilla faster and leaner and more biomechanically plausible. Anno and Higuchi made him slower and stranger and more deeply, viscerally wrong. Shin Godzilla is a creature in the process of becoming. He does not arrive on screen in a finished form. He evolves over the course of the film, through a series of increasingly disturbing stages that begin with something almost pathetic, a bulky, goggle-eyed, stumbling thing that moves through shallow water with the uncoordinated lurching of a body, not yet adapted to its own dimensions, and culminate in something that has no precedent in the franchise's visual history. The final form of Shin Godzilla is not frightening in the way that large things are frightening. It is frightening in the way that wrong things are frightening. Ning, things that violate the expected relationship between form and function, that look like they are in pain, that carry in their physical appearance the evidence of a process that is ongoing and uncontrolled, and that will not stop at the current configuration, because stopping is not something it is capable of. His skin is the red and black of severe burns, of flesh that has been damaged past the point of normal tissue, and has continued to exist anyway, damaged and existing simultaneously in a way that should not be possible. His eyes are small and white and fixed, and do not track and do not focus and contain no evidence of the consciousness that his behavior implies he possesses. His movement, in the final form, has the quality of something that is not fully mastered bipedal locomotion, and does not need to, something that moves adequately despite its incompleteness because adequacy is all the situation requires of it. Most disturbing of all are the figures protruding from his tail and from the gill-like structures along his torso in certain shots, shapes that suggest, without confirming, the presence of human forms absorbed into or emerging from the creature's mass. This detail is never explained. Anno does not explain it. He presents it as one presents evidence, and leaves the audience to construct from the evidence whatever interpretation their own psychology leads them to. The interpretation that the visual material most directly supports, that Godzilla is made, in some fashion, from human beings, that the disaster contains within it the bodies of its victims, is the interpretation that connects most directly to the film's Fukushima subtext, to the idea of a nuclear catastrophe that absorbs human lives into itself, and continues to grow and mutate and cannot be stopped by the removal of the humans from its vicinity, because the humans are already inside it. The atomic breath sequence, the moment in every Godzilla film in which the creature uses his signature weapon, is in Shin Godzilla the most terrifying version of that moment in the franchise's history. It does not begin as atomic breath. It begins as something else, as a purple-black fluid that flows from Godzilla's mouth into the ground and the water around him, that spreads and burns and cannot be contained. Then it becomes flame, pouring upward, the fluid igniting as it rises. Then, finally, it becomes the beam. The concentrated purple-white ray that cuts through buildings not by impact but by dissolution, that removes what it touches from existence with a precision and completeness that is more horrifying than explosion, because explosion implies force, implies physics, implies a world still operating according to rules. Shin Godzilla's atomic breath implies the suspension of rules. It implies a weapon that does not behave like a weapon because it was not made to be a weapon. It is simply what happens when this creature expels energy. It is a biological process. It cannot be negotiated with, because it is not a decision. The sequence in which the beam fires across nighttime Tokyo, cutting through the city in a sustained, slow, purple-white line, the buildings on either side dissolving into falling debris in its wake, the camera pulling back to show the scale of the devastation from above, was compared immediately by Japanese critics and audiences to the Hiroshima footage, not metaphorically, visually. The image of a line of destruction cutting through a grid of city streets, of buildings falling away from a central point of impact, of fire spreading outward from the point of contact, This was the shape of what an atomic bomb does to a city, rendered in the visual language of 2016 digital effects with a directness that the original Gojira, working with rubber, suits and miniature sets, had approached but never quite achieved with such naked clarity. Anno had opened the wound. Not probed it, not referenced it, not acknowledged it at a respectful distance. Opened it, reached into the 60-year history of the franchise and the 70-year history of Japanese nuclear anxiety, and pulled the original content back to the surface, updated it for a present in which Fukushima had confirmed everything that 1954 had feared, and put it on screen without softening, and without the consolation of a resolution that made the audience feel the situation was manageable. Shin Godzilla does not end with Godzilla defeated. It ends with Godzilla frozen, stopped in place by a chemical intervention, immobilized in the middle of Tokyo, still standing, still present, the problem not solved but temporarily suspended. The final shot of the creature reveals, in the figures extending from his tail, the clearest suggestion yet of human forms in the process of emergence. Something that was human becoming something that is not, caught in the moment of transformation. Anno holds on this image. He does not cut away from it. He allows the audience to look at it for long enough to understand that this is not an ending, that what has been accomplished is not resolution, but pause, that the creature in the middle of the city is still the creature in the middle of the city and will remain so until whatever comes next. This is not the ending of an action film. It is the ending of a film about a crisis that has not been resolved. It is the ending of a film about Fukushima, where the damaged reactors were not fixed but contained, where the exclusion zone was not lifted but managed, where the people who had been evacuated were not returned to their homes but told that return was being worked toward, where the gap between the actual situation and the official tension of the actual situation remained, as it had remained since 1945. A permanent feature of Japan's relationship with nuclear technology. The film was received in Japan as an event, in the way that the original 1954 film had been received as an event, not as a franchise entry or a commercial product, but as a cultural document that was doing something necessary and difficult and true. It won 7 Japan Academy Film Prizes, including Picture of the Year. It was discussed in newspapers and on television programs not primarily as a monster film, but as a political film, as a work of social criticism, as a response to Fukushima and to the institutional failures the disaster had exposed. The critical conversation around it was the critical conversation of a culture recognizing itself in a mirror and finding the reflection uncomfortable and important. Anno had done what Honda had done. He had found the form that the moment required. Honda's moment had required a monster born from nuclear testing, slow and indifferent and impossible to stop, moving through a burning city while survivors sat in hospitals. Anno's moment required a monster born from nuclear meltdown, mutating and agonized and impossible to finish, frozen in the middle of the city while the committees continued to meet. Both monsters were the same monster. Both wounds were the same wound. 62 years separated them and nothing essential had changed. Not the nuclear anxiety, not the institutional failure, not the gap between official reassurance and actual risk, not the specific Japanese experience of being a country that had reason above all others to understand what nuclear energy meant, when it escaped its containers and moved through the world according to its own logic, indifferent to the boundaries drawn around it, and the assurances given about its behavior. The wound Anno opened in 2016 was the wound. Honda had opened in 1954. It had never closed. It had been covered, periodically, with children's films and franchise sequels and American reboots, and the general forward motion of a culture that needed, for commercial and psychological reasons, to treat the monster as entertainment rather than testimony. But testimony was what it had always been. Testimony was what it remained. The creature frozen in the ruins of Tokyo, the human forms emerging from its tail, the committees still in session, the problem suspended rather than solved. This was not fiction. This was the shape of a country's ongoing, unresolved, carefully managed, periodically erupting relationship with the thing it had been carrying since the morning of August 6, 1945, when the sky opened and the world changed and the wound began that has not yet, in any full or final sense, closed. Shin Godzilla did not close it. It was not trying to close it. It was trying to make sure everyone could see it was still open. There is a shot in Gareth Edwards' 2014 Godzilla that contains, in a single image, both everything the Monsterverse would achieve and everything it would ultimately surrender. A military officer stands at the open door of a cargo plane, parachuting into San Francisco, and below him through the clouds the creature is visible. Enormous, moving through the city, half obscured by smoke and distance. The shot is held for several seconds. The officer does not speak. The music swells with something that is not quite triumph and not quite terror, but occupies the uncomfortable space between them. The space of something vast being witnessed from a position of complete powerlessness. For those few seconds, the film achieves what it is reaching for. The sublime in the original philosophical sense, the experience of something so far beyond human scale that the appropriate response is not action but awe, not engagement but the paralyzed, humbling recognition of one's own smallness. Then the parachutes open. The soldiers land. The action begins, and the film makes the choice that will define not just its own trajectory, but the entire franchise that follows it. The choice to make Godzilla, gradually and then completely, something the audience roots for. It is worth being precise about what is being lost in that choice, because the loss is not simple and the gain is not nothing, and any honest account of the Monsterverse has to hold both of these things simultaneously. What legendary pictures built across the films that followed Edwards' original? Godzilla, King of the Monsters in 2019, Godzilla vs. Kong in 2021, Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire in 2024, The One Set of Kong, The New Empire in 2024, and the various Kong-centric entries that populate the franchise's margins, is a coherent, commercially successful, genuinely enjoyable entertainment universe that has introduced Godzilla to audiences who might never have encountered him otherwise, and has sustained mainstream interest in kaiju cinema for over a decade. These are real achievements. The films are not without craft, not without moments of genuine visual wonder, not without the specific pleasure of watching very large things interact with each other and with the world at a scale that cinema is uniquely equipped to render. But the specific pleasure they provide is a different pleasure than the one Honda was providing. And the difference is not incidental. It is the central fact about what the Monsterverse is and what it cannot be. And understanding it requires understanding what the decision to make Godzilla a Guardian actually costs in terms of what the decision to make Godzilla was originally built to do. Gareth Edwards came to the 2014 film with a genuine and documented engagement with the source material. He had seen Honda's original. He understood, at least intellectually, what it had been. He spoke in interviews before the film's release about his intention to restore gravity to the character, to make a Godzilla film that felt consequential, that treated destruction as something with human weight rather than pure spectacle. The film he made reflects this intention in its first two acts with some success. The opening sequences, the Gojira nuclear plant disaster, the 15-year ellipsis, Bryan Cranston's grief-hollowed performance as a man who has spent a decade and a half trying to prove that what he knows happened actually happened, carry genuine weight. The decision to withhold Godzilla for as long as possible, to show his presence through consequence and peripheral glimpse rather than direct display, produces a quality of dread that the later films completely abandon. And then the film arrives at its third act, and something shifts. Godzilla defeats the Mutos. He saves San Francisco, in the sense that his victory over the creatures that were threatening it constitutes a form of salvation, however inadvertent. He lies on the waterfront amid the rubble of the city he has partially destroyed, and a news ticker crawls across the screen in the film's final moments. King of the monsters, savior of our city. The question mark is doing significant work in that headline, but it is the last honest punctuation the franchise will use on the subject. By the time King of the Monsters arrives in 2019, the question mark is gone. Godzilla is the hero. The film is structured around his heroism. The human characters exist, in large part, to appreciate and facilitate, and occasionally imperil the heroism of a creature that the original film had built as the embodiment of nuclear apocalypse. The 2019 film is the most revealing entry in the franchise precisely because it is the most committed to the logic it has inherited, and the least interested in ironing it. It is a film in which a monarch scientist, played by Vera Farmiga, argues that humanity should deliberately awaken the Titans, the Monsterverse's term for the various giant creatures whose existence the franchise posits, on the grounds that their presence will restore ecological balance to a planet damaged by human activity. This argument is presented with complete seriousness and is, within the film's moral framework, essentially correct. The Titans are not threats to be eliminated. They are necessary. They are part of a natural order that preceded humanity, and that humanity has disrupted. Godzilla is not a monster. He is an alpha predator, fulfilling a biological role, a force of natural regulation that existed before humans, and will exist after them, that humans have foolishly and arrogantly attempted to replace with their own technological systems, and that must now be allowed to reassert its proper function. This is as a piece of ecological philosophy, not without interest. The idea that human civilization's relationship to nature is one of disruption, rather than stewardship, that the appropriate human posture toward non-human natural forces might be deference, rather than control, is a genuine and serious idea that has real currency in contemporary environmental thought. As a framework for a Godzilla film, however, it performs a transformation on the character so complete that it inverts his original meaning rather than extending it. Honda's Godzilla was the consequence of humanity's arrogance toward nature, specifically in the form of nuclear technology. He was what happened when human beings attempted to control forces they did not fully understand and could not fully contain. The Monsterverse's Godzilla is the corrective to that arrogance. He is nature's enforcement mechanism, the thing that puts humanity back in its place, the alpha that maintains the balance the humans have disturbed. In Honda's version, Godzilla is the problem. In the Monsterverse, Godzilla is the solution. The nuclear metaphor has not merely been softened, it has been reversed. The creature that was born from the failure of human attempts to control nuclear power has become a creature that exists to control the failures of human civilization. He has gone from consequence to corrective, from verdict to guardian. From the thing that happens when you do what you should not do to the thing that fixes what you have broken. This reversal is not accidental. It reflects something real about the cultural moment in which the Monsterverse was constructed, a moment of significant ecological anxiety in which the idea of nature as an active force capable of punishing human excess had considerable popular currency, in which the fantasy of a guardian large enough to protect the planet from humanity's worst impulses was emotionally legible in ways it might not have been in other historical periods. The Monsterverse is, among other things, an ecological fantasy, a vision of a world in which something powerful enough to enforce balance actually exists and is, fundamentally, on the side of life. This fantasy has genuine emotional appeal. The film's commercial success is partial evidence of how widely that appeal extends. But the appeal is the problem. Or rather, the appeal is the symptom of the problem. Because what the Monsterverse is selling when it sells this fantasy is comfort. And comfort is the one thing that Godzilla was specifically, structurally, originally designed to refuse. Honda's film offered no comfort. It offered truth. which was that the forces humanity had set in motion could not be controlled, and would not protect the innocent, and could not be appealed to on the basis of innocence, because they were not capable of distinguishing the innocent from the guilty. The comfort the Monsterverse offers, that there is something large enough and powerful enough to protect us, that the forces of nature are ultimately on our side, that the alpha predator nods at the small human standing on the dock and thereby confers a kind of benediction, is comfort purchased at the cost of the specific honesty that made the original matter. The nod is the moment that crystallizes this most completely. At the end of King of the Monsters, as Godzilla stands victorious amid the destruction he has caused and permitted, the monarch scientist who has been the film's primary human protagonist stands before him. He looks at her, she looks at him. Something passes between them. A recognition, an acknowledgement, a communication that the film presents as profoundly meaningful, but carefully declines to fully specify. Then he turns and walks into the ocean. The film treats this moment with the reverence of a religious encounter, as though the nod is a form of grace, the large thing seeing the small thing and finding it worthy of acknowledgement. Honda's Godzilla did not nod. Honda's Godzilla did not see the small things at all, in any sense that mattered. This was not because Honda was less sophisticated, or less interested in the relationship between the creature and the humans in his vicinity. It was because the creature Honda built was, by design, and by necessity, incapable of the kind of recognition the nod implies. A creature that can nod is a creature that perceives individual humans as meaningful, as distinct, as worth registering. A creature that is the embodiment of nuclear consequence cannot do this, because nuclear consequence does not perceive individual humans as meaningful. It does not distinguish between the scientist trying to stop it and the family trying to flee it. It moves through the world according to principles that have nothing to do with human significance, and the horror of this, the absolute democratic, indifferent horror of a force that cannot see you as a person, is the specific horror that the original film was constructed to produce. The Monsterverse cannot produce this horror, because it has given Godzilla the nod. Once the creature can see you, once it can register your individual presence, and respond to it with something coded as recognition or approval, it has been domesticated in the most fundamental sense. Not tamed in the sense of being controlled, but tamed in the sense of being made to participate in the human need for significance, or the reassurance that something large and powerful has noticed us and found us acceptable. This is not the relationship Honda built, it is the relationship the audience of the Monsterverse wants to have. And the franchise, being a commercial enterprise with genuine sensitivity to its audience's desires, has provided it. The later entries in the franchise, Godzilla vs. Kong and its sequel Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire, abandon even the pretense of the ecological framework and commit fully to the logic of superhero cinema, which is the logic that has most completely colonized the Monsterverse's aesthetic and narrative grammar. In these films, Godzilla is a protagonist in the most conventional sense, an agent with goals, with something resembling motivation, with a role in a narrative that has antagonists and escalations and resolutions structured around his capacity to overcome the obstacles placed before him. The films are, in their own terms, entertaining. They have the quality of theme park rides rendered in digital effects, immersive, kinetically satisfying, delivering the promised spectacle with professional competence. They are also almost completely empty of anything resembling the weight that Honda was carrying when he made his film. The superhero grammar is not incidental to this emptiness. Superhero narratives are structurally incompatible with the kind of horror Honda was making, because superhero narratives are organized around the reassurance of competent agency, around the fantasy that the right individual, with the right powers, can address the threat and restore order. The threat in a superhero narrative is always, at some level, manageable, because the genre's fundamental promise is that it will be managed. The hero will win, or will sacrifice themselves in a way that enables victory, but the world will be made safe by the application of sufficient individual power. This is a deeply consoling narrative structure. which is why it dominates popular entertainment in periods of widespread anxiety. It offers the fantasy of control, of problems with solutions, of forces that can be opposed and defeated by the correct deployment of strength. Honda's Godzilla was the explicit negation of this fantasy. There is no superhero in Gojira. There is no figure whose individual power is adequate to address the threat. The oxygen destroyer is not a superpower. It is a weapon of mass destruction that kills its user, and that the scientist who wields it destroys the plans for precisely because he understands that weapons of mass destruction in the hands of individuals are not solutions, but new versions of the original problem. The film's ending is not triumphant. It is elegiac. The threat has been addressed at enormous cost, in a way that will not prevent future versions of the same threat, and the final note is not relief but the sustained quiet, unresolved grief of people who have survived something they were not supposed to survive, and who cannot say with confidence that survival means safety. The Monsterverse cannot end this way because its audience does not come to these films for edge. They come for the spectacle of large things fighting each other, for the pleasure of rooting for the creature they have been given to root for the specific excitement of watching the character they love win. These desires are not contemptible. They are real and they produce real pleasure, and the films that satisfy them have genuine value as entertainment. But they are desires organized around comfort and resolution and the reassurance of a universe in which the forces of nature are fundamentally benign, or at least manageable, or at least on our side. And these desires are exactly what Honda's film was built to refuse. You cannot fear what you are rooting for. This is the paradox, and it is not merely a critical observation about tone or execution. It is a structural incompatibility between two different things. Cinema can do two different relationships it can construct between the audience and what they are watching. Fear requires distance, the distance of something that does not care whether you survive, that moves through the world according to principles that have nothing to do with your welfare, that cannot be appealed to or reasoned with or made to nod. Rooting requires identification, the collapsing of distance, the alignment of the audience's emotional investment with the creature's survival and success, the construction of a relationship in which the creature's victories are the audience's victories. The Monsterverse chose identification. It chose it commercially, because identification is more reliably profitable than fear in a franchise context. Because audiences return to characters they love in ways they do not return to characters they merely dread. Because merchandise and sequels and expanded universes are built on affection rather than terror. The choice was rational. The choice was arguably inevitable, given the industrial context in which the Monsterverse was built and the audience expectations that context had trained. The choice produced a successful franchise that has sustained mainstream engagement with kaiju cinema for a decade and introduced the character to audiences who might never have sought out Honda's original. And the choice costs something that cannot be recovered within the Monsterverse's current logic, the specific, irreplaceable, truthful horror of a creature that does not know you are there, that moves through the city without seeing you, that cannot nod because it cannot see you clearly enough to nod at, because you are too small to register as individual rather than aggregate, because you are, from its perspective and from the perspective of the forces it represents, simply part of the general category of things in its path. Honda put his audience inside that category. He made them feel what it was to be in the path of something that could not distinguish them from everything else it was destroying. The Monsterverse moved the audience out of the path and put them beside the creature, gave them the creature's perspective, made them large by proxy. It is a generous gift. It feels good to be large, but it is not what Godzilla was made for. He was made to make you feel small. He was made to make you feel the specific smallness of standing in the path of a consequence you cannot stop, that you or people like you or the civilization you are part of set in motion. That is moving toward you with the indifferent weight of something that existed before you and will exist after you and has no interest in the distinction. The Monsterverse gave him a crown and called him king. Honda gave him a roar and called him reckoning. The reckoning does not nod. It does not need to. It does not know you are there. Every culture that has survived long enough to accumulate a mythology has produced, somewhere, in that mythology, a figure that will not stay dead. Not a figure that is immortal in the simple sense of being unable to die, but a figure that dies repeatedly and returns repeatedly, that is defeated and forgotten and rediscovered, that means different things to different generations without ever fully belonging to any of them, that seems always to have arrived from somewhere older than its current form, and to be pointing toward something not yet fully visible in its future. These figures are not popular, because they are entertaining, though they are often entertaining. They are popular because they are necessary. They fill a space in the cultural imagination that nothing else can fill. A space that opens up periodically, that becomes urgent, that demands occupation by something large enough, and old enough and flexible enough to hold whatever the moment is pouring into it. Godzilla is one of these figures. He has become one across 70 years and 30-odd films, and more merchandise and adaptations and cultural references than any single accounting can fully capture. He was not born as one. He was born as something specific and local, and historically grounded, a Japanese film made in 1954 by a director walking through grief from a specific set of events that had occurred in a specific country in a specific decade, addressed to a specific audience whose specific wound it was shaped to acknowledge. The universality came later, or rather it was latent in the original and became apparent as the original was carried into other contexts by other hands for other purposes, each carrying revealing something about what the figure contained that the original context had not fully disclosed. What it contained was the question, or rather the two questions that are always, in every version of the story, regardless of how far it drifts from Honda's original vision. The questions underneath everything else. What are we afraid of now? What have we done that we cannot take back? These questions are the legend beneath the legend. They are what remains when you strip away the specific design of the suit, the specific geography of the city being destroyed, the specific political and commercial decisions that shaped each individual entry in the franchise. They are what persists across the versions that contradict each other, that reverse each other's meanings, that transform the creature so completely from one iteration to the next, that the only visible continuity is the silhouette. Underneath the silhouette, the questions are always there, always being asked, always generating the specific urgency that makes each generation feel it needs its own version of this particular story. The first question, what are we afraid of now, is the more visible one, the one that critics and scholars have documented most thoroughly. Because fear in the context of a monster film is legible and discussable in ways that guilt is not always. Honda's 1954 fear was nuclear annihilation, specifically and unambiguously. The fear of the transitional 1960s films was less focused but gestured toward the general anxieties of rapid modernization, of a Japan transforming itself at a pace that produced its own kind of vertigo. The fear of the 1984 reboot was nuclear war in the Cold War context, the specific fear of a country caught between superpowers each pointing weapons in its direction. The fear of Shin Godzilla was institutional failure in the face of nuclear disaster, the fear that the systems built to protect people would prioritize their own continuity over the people they were built to protect. The fear of the Monsterverse is ecological, the fear of a nature so thoroughly disrupted by human activity that it has become unpredictable, ungovernable, capable of responses that dwarf human defensive capacity. Each of these fears is real. Each reflects something genuine in the cultural moment that produced it. The fact that they are so different from each other, that nuclear apocalypse and ecological collapse and institutional failure and Cold War nuclear exchange are not the same fear and do not produce the same story, is precisely what demonstrates the depth of the vessel that carries them. A shallow vessel can hold one thing. A vessel deep enough to hold all of these, across 70 years in multiple cultural contexts, is something else. Something whose depth is a function not of its emptiness, but of its structure, of the specific shape of the questions it is organized to ask. which are questions open enough that each generation's most urgent anxieties can be poured into them without distortion. The second question, what have we done that we cannot take back, is the one that runs deeper and that is less frequently acknowledged, perhaps because it is less comfortable. Fear is passive in a way that guilt is not. To ask what we are afraid of is to position the self as potential victim, as the one to whom something threatening might be done. To ask what we have done that we cannot take back is to position the self as agent, as the one who has already done something, who is living in the aftermath of a choice, or a set of choices that cannot be undone and whose consequences are still unfolding. The first question is about what might happen. The second is about what has happened, and what it means that it has happened, and what it costs to continue living in a world where it has happened. Honda's Godzilla was organized around the second question at least as much as the first. The creature was not simply a threat, he was a consequence. He was the thing that had been set in motion by decisions already made, by the nuclear tests already conducted, by the weapons already deployed, by the particular human arrogance of believing that forces of that magnitude could be controlled and contained and used without generating responses that escape control and contained. The specific emotional texture of the original film is not simply fear, it is guilt. It is the guilt of a civilization that has done something it cannot take back, and is now watching the consequence move through its cities, and cannot stop watching because stopping would require not looking at what you have done, and there is a moral obligation, however painful, to look. This is why the figure has never been available for simple celebration. Even in the versions that most aggressively attempt to convert him into a hero, the Monsterverse films position Godzilla as a guardian, as a force of natural correction, as the creature that protects humanity from its own worst tendencies. And yet even in these films, even in the versions most thoroughly committed to the fantasy of benign protection, there is a residual guilt that the narrative cannot fully metabolize. The Titans were awakened because humans did something. The ecological imbalance exists because humans did something. The need for a corrective force that operates outside human control and cannot be directed by human agency exists because humans did something, and the something that humans did is always, however euphemistically framed, the same category of something that Honda's humans did in 1954. It is the something of technological hubris, of the arrogant assumption that the forces set in motion by human ingenuity can be managed by human ingenuity, of the failure to adequately reckon with the gap between the scale of what has been created and the scale of human capacity to govern it. The guilt survives the hero narrative because the hero narrative cannot actually resolve the guilt. It can displace it, can transform it into ecological anxiety or institutional critique or Cold War geopolitics, can dress it in different clothes in each decade, but the underlying structure, we did something we should not have done and the world is different. Because of it, and no amount of subsequent heroism or corrective action fully addresses that difference, is the structure that the figure was built on, and that no version of the story has yet found a way to dismantle. Godzilla endures partly because the guilt he was made from endures. The wound is still open. The thing that cannot be taken back in any generation. And each generation that encounters the figure encounters also, whether it knows it or not, the specific historical weight that the figure has been carrying since Honda first put it on screen. The mirror metaphor is the one that feels most adequate to what the figure actually does, more adequate than monster or metaphor or symbol, which are all accurate but all too limited. A monster is something you fear from outside. A metaphor is something that stands for something else. A symbol is something whose meaning is fixed by convention. A mirror is something that shows you yourself, that produces an image whose content changes depending on who is standing in front of it and what they are carrying when they stand there. The mirror does not impose a meaning on its viewer. It reflects the meaning the viewer brings to it, gives that meaning back in a form that makes it visible, that makes it possible to look at directly, in a way that looking at the thing itself does not always permit. This is what Godzilla does in each of his iterations. Honda's audience stood before the mirror and saw their nuclear grief, The children of the 1960s stood before it and saw their need for protection. The Japanese audience of 1984 stood before it and saw their Cold War anxiety and their nuclear proximity. Anno's audience stood before it and saw Fukushima and the institutional failure and the gap between official reassurance and actual risk. The Monsterverse audience stands before it and sees ecological crisis and the fantasy of a natural corrective. The mirror does not tell any of these audiences what to see. It is shaped by Honda's original construction, by the specific dimensions of the figure he made, by the questions embedded in its structure, to reflect the things its viewers are already carrying, to give those things a form large enough to look at without being destroyed by looking. The weighting is part of the mirror's function. Godzilla does not always appear. He goes back into the water between films, between cycles of the franchise, between the moments when the culture needs him badly enough to make another version of the story. The 9-year hiatus between 1975 and 1984 was not simply a commercial decision. It was, in retrospect, the figure waiting in the water until the culture's anxiety had built to sufficient pressure that a new version became not just commercially viable, but culturally necessary. The same logic applies to the longer gaps and the shorter ones, to the periods of franchise dormancy and the periods of intense production. The figure does not force itself on the culture. It waits until the culture's fear and guilt have reached the threshold at which the questions need to be asked again, at which the mirror needs to be held up again, at which the existing forms of cultural self-examination have proven inadequate to the specific shape of what the moment is feeling. 70 years is a long time for a figure to remain necessary. Most cultural phenomena burn bright and fade, exhaust their relevance, become objects of nostalgia rather than active vessels of cultural meaning. The ones that endure across generations without becoming merely nostalgic are the ones organized around questions that do not expire. Questions that each generation inherits and must answer for itself, not because previous generations answered wrong, but because the questions are not the kind that stay answered. What are we afraid of now is a question that requires a new answer in every decade, because the content of collective fear is never static. What have we done that we cannot take back is a question that accumulates rather than resolves, that becomes heavier rather than lighter as the list of irreversible acts lengthens. The list is longer now than it was in 1954. This is not pessimism. It is accounting. The nuclear weapons that inspired Honda's films still exist, in greater numbers and with greater destructive capacity than the weapons that existed when he was making it. The nuclear power infrastructure that failed at Fukushima still exists, and the question of its management and its risk is not resolved. The ecological disruption that the Monsterverse encodes as its primary anxiety is measurable and documented and accelerating. The institutional failures that Anno depicted in Shin Godzilla, the gap between what authorities know and what they say, between what the situation requires and what the system is capable of providing, are not failures specific to Japan or to 2011. They are structural features of how large institutions manage information in the presence of crisis, and they recur with a regularity that makes satire of them feel less like critique and more like description. Godzilla was made from this world. He was made from the specific historical content of 1954 Japan, but the questions he was organized around are questions that the world keeps generating new content for. Each decade provides fresh material for the mirror. Each decade produces new versions of the fear and the guilt that Honda encoded into the original creature, new forms of the anxiety about human technological overreach and its consequences, new iterations of the institutional failure and the nuclear proximity and the ecological disruption and the gap between human ambition and human wisdom. The figure waits in the water between these moments not because he is patient, but because he does not require patience. He does not experience the waiting. He simply is, present in the cultural imagination in a way that is not diminished by dormancy, that can survive periods of commercial exploitation and narrative dilution, and franchise mismanagement without losing the essential thing, because the essential thing is not in any particular film, or any particular design, or any particular approach to the character. It is in the questions. The questions cannot be exploited. They cannot be diluted. They cannot be mismanaged. They can be temporarily ignored, temporarily covered with entertainment and spectacle, and the various commercial imperatives that shape what the culture makes and distributes and consumes. But they remain underneath the entertainment, waiting for the moment when the covering becomes insufficient and the questions push back to the surface. This is the legend beneath the legend, not the radioactive breath or the atomic origin or the city-destroying scale, though all of these are part of it. Not the specific design or the suitmation technique or the miniature sets or the digital effects that have replaced them, not even the grief that Honda carried into his original film, though the grief is the foundation. Everything else is built on. The legend beneath the legend is the structure of the questions themselves, their openness, their persistence, their capacity to be asked and asked again without exhaustion, their specific relevance to the particular situation. If a species that has developed the capacity to destroy itself and has not yet developed the wisdom to govern that capacity, that keeps doing things it cannot take back, and then must find ways to live in the aftermath of having done them. The mirror has been standing in the water for 70 years. Each generation that approaches it sees something different, because each generation carries different content to the reflection. Each generation makes its version of the story, pours its specific fears and guilts into the vessel, shapes the figure according to the particular pressures of its particular moment. Each version is partial. Each version is, in some way, a distortion. An emphasis of some aspects of the original at the expense of others, a selective engagement with the questions that ignores some and foregrounds others. This is not a failure of any particular version. It is the nature of a figure this old and this necessary, a figure that no single version can exhaust, because it was built to hold more than any single version can contain. What endures is not the monster. The monster is a costume, changed in every decade, redesigned according to the aesthetic priorities and technological capacities of each new production. What endures is not the franchise, which has been commercially successful and commercially dormant and commercially revived and commercially mismanaged in ways that track the general history of intellectual property in the entertainment industry, without revealing anything essential about the figure itself. What endures is not even Honda's original film, though that film is the root system from which everything else grows and without which nothing else would exist. What endures is the question and the silhouette, the question that is visible in every version of the figure regardless of how the figure has been redesigned, or repositioned, or repurposed. Visible in the specific shape of something enormous rising from water that should not contain anything of that scale. Something that was not here and then was here. Something whose presence means that something else has already happened. Something that cannot be undone. Something that the small figures running in the streets below were part of, whether they knew it or not, whether they chose it or not, whether they are guilty in the personal moral sense, or simply alive in the historical moment that produced the consequence, now moving toward them. He is not a creature. A creature has a biology, a habitat, a behavioral repertoire explicable by evolutionary pressure. He has all of these things in the various films that depict him, but they are not what he is. He is a mirror. He is the specific shape that a culture's deepest anxiety takes when that anxiety needs to be seen, rather than felt. When the thing that cannot be said directly is given a form large enough to look at without collapsing. He has been standing in the water for 70 years, and the water is not the Pacific Ocean. The water is history. The water is the accumulated weight of what has been done and not undone, chosen and not unchosen, set in motion and not stopped. The water is always rising. The figure standing in it is always the same figure, asking the same questions in a voice too large for the questions to be ignored, too large for the people running in the streets below to pretend they have not heard. What are we afraid of now? What have we done that we cannot take back? The questions do not change. Only the faces of the people standing in the street change. Only the specific content of what they are running from changes. The figure in the water remains. Patient in the way that consequences are patient. Present in the way that history is present. Waiting to be understood. Waiting to be asked. Still standing. Still enormous. Still asking. You have just walked the full length of something enormous. From the ash falling on the lucky dragon. 5 to the bureaucrat still in session while Tokyo burns. From Haruo Nakajima losing 20 pounds of water weight inside a rubber suit to Roland Emmerich's iguana running through Manhattan. From the mother in the hospital that America cut out of the film in 1956 to the human forms emerging from Godzilla's tail in 2016. From the children who fell in love with a babysitter to the adults who cannot explain why a monster nodding at a scientist makes them feel, briefly and inexplicably, safe. You've been here for a long time now. The fog is thicker. The water is still. This is where we leave him tonight. Standing where he has always stood, in the place where history meets the present tense. In the water that is not really water, asking the questions that do not really stop. But you have done enough thinking for one night. Let your breathing slow. Let the cities go quiet. Let the fog come in. You do not need to solve anything. You do not need to hold on to any of it. The questions will be there tomorrow. Patient as they have always been, waiting as they have always waited. For now the only thing asked of you is rest. The monster is back in the water. The water is calm. You are safe. If this kind of slow, careful, slightly obsessive history is what your nights are made of, subscribe. There's more where this came from. New episodes settle in quietly, without fanfare, whenever the next story is ready to be told. Until then, sleep well. You've earned it. Tai T echoes for sleep. Where the past becomes the most comfortable place to rest.